Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to warmly welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Caribbean Studies to the annual Walter Rodney lecture. And this year we'll be having a symposium speaking about Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation today, 2017. Our coordinator of this event, Ajamu, located this symposium to explore economic ideas and practices that can challenge and undermine capitalism while addressing the collective and individual needs of the working class and build its capacity for self-emancipation. Again, my name is Shelley Morgan, and all I'll be doing is guiding you through this presentation because there'll be a lot of good talk and a good reasoning. And let me now invite my good friend to give a warm welcome from the Institute of Caribbean Studies, Mr. Hugh Dabbs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morgan. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And the Institute of Caribbean Studies, led by our director, Dr. Sonia Stanley Nair, has been mounting this lecture as a way to bring to focus the type of work that Walter Rodney brought to the wider community from the academy. Dr. Nair apologizes that she can't be with us this evening. She's at another meeting dealing with some plans engaging cultural studies within the public space, some things that you'll be hearing of in the public domain very shortly. But she sends her warm greetings. And we want you to know that over the years, as we have mounted observances of Walter Rodney's life, the prominent event has been a Walter Rodney lecture. But 2 or 3 years ago, the Institute shifted from that signal event to start engaging others in the community in other ways. So 2 years ago, there was a petition being signed related to the investigation into the assassination of Walter Rodney. And the Institute mounted a tent in the center of the Humanities and Education courtyard, trying to solicit such signatures for that petition from members of the university and wider Jamaican community. We hold up Walter Rodney because we believe he represents one of the shining examples of the ways in which as academics we must engage the public, the ways in which we must be relevant to the society. The university is really for the exploration of the universe of knowledge in the best interest of the societies that it serves. And when a man such as Walter Rodney faces the entanglement of hegemony as he seeks to do so, and we know the history, and those of us who don't, just let me remind you that he was declared persona non grata by the government of Jamaica on his return from a conference in Canada because of a misinterpretation of thoughts that he shared in the period of time when the world was nervous in the Cold War about ideological polarization. And so as we look at Walter Rodney today, through this engagement, it's in a sense another such moment in the world. And he's always relevant, but his methodology is one of the things that Dr. Ajamu and the rest of the Institute would like to also hold up. The groundation method engages at the grassroots level, persons not just banking into them knowledge as if they know nothing, but extrapolating from them the wisdoms that have always resided in our people. So we want to, as an institute, welcome you all, to applaud the work of Dr. Ajamu, to thank all the panelists who will be sharing, and to wish for you an engagement that will redound to a greater universal community. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Help me now welcome Ms. Tina Renier, UWI student and youth advocate, as she speaks to the relevance of Walter Rodney to students, academic workers, and the working class. Welcome, Tina.
Good evening, members of the audience. Nobody on the bridge inquires about the tools needed to fix the bridge, nor was it incomplete in the first place. The absence of a critical and radical thought in the Caribbean is a matter of grave concern. But they were never trained to look at the Caribbean through Caribbean eyes. This is a quote from Professor Anthony Boakes about the decolonization politics of Black Power and Walter Rodney. The era of the 1960s in Jamaica, the Caribbean and the global South community was a symbolic era. It was marked by radicalism, the struggle for state and citizen self-determination, and most importantly, asserting the humanity of the poor and the powerless. The working class communities were mobilized into a formidable force to challenge the powers that be, and it was a fearless third world figure who was at the helm of this revolution. His name is Dr. Walter Rodney. He is affectionately known as Brother Wally by the masses. Currently, the ideological fervor of the 1960s has shifted immensely. The politics of community spirit, consciousness raising, and collective effort to dismantle the capitalist system has now changed to a politics of accepting the status quo, silent neutrality, and the persistent poverty of ideas and actions to energize the masses towards a new path of liberation. Members of the audience, it is not just Brother Wally that has died, but it's radicalism in the global South that has also died. Independence of the new era was greeted by embrace, overwhelming sense of pride and celebration by the oppressed people. But today, there is little or nothing to celebrate about, as new methods of control and exploitation have continued, and the poor has remained powerless. Everything has reverted back into a historical period of colonialism, but as I've said before, there are new methods of oppression. Rodney's ideas and contribution to the third world is more relevant to today's society than we could ever think. There is a new global order that we have been programming to be accepted. It is a global order where power is defined based on who has access to material resources, that's money and ownership of property. Power is about who has the ability to influence decisions. It's about who has the ability to create belief systems, knowledge, and oversee social institutions such as the education system, politics, media, religion, and so on. All of these aspects of power help to solidify a false consciousness. Our people for centuries have been promised hope and privileges to elevate on the basis if they conform to the rules and standards that have been established by capitalism. But in fact, only the wealthiest 1% controls and will benefit from these promised privileges. We will remain in a powerless position if we fail to understand how the system works. We will remain enslaved to this false consciousness if we fail to replace a new model of liberation and if we fail to mobilize ourselves collectively. If capitalism was used to justify slavery, racism, genocide, classism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, why then should we look to capitalism as a source of our liberation? These are some fundamental ideas that while Walter Rodney was alive, he has etched into his scholarly works such as How Europe Has Underdeveloped Africa, and through his grassroots activism for the working classes. for students and young people. Walter Rodney was not the type of scholar activist that would come here and tell you what you would like to hear, but rather he challenged norms and values that we would have normally accepted. Students and young people, we have a critical responsibility to either play an active role in the liberation model or to become traitors of our own freedom. Through teaching Black history and on the development of our own country and region, Walter Rodney emphasized the importance of embracing personal politics. How is it we can use our personal experience of living on the margins of society to champion for social justice and equity? How can we link our personal experiences to the political roots of oppression by identifying that we are actually oppressed? Students and young people, Rodney has paved on the way to show us that nothing is wrong with being collective, with organizing our protests that tramples against the rights and the humanities of people for centuries. There is no such thing as a neutral stance when it comes on to exploitation of our brothers and our sisters. Silence is consent to the master's wishes. The difference between students and young activists back then and now is that during Rodney's years on campus, young people were grounded and rooted in their African identity. They shared stories of their struggles with each other. They organized themselves, and most importantly, they were committed to making sacrifices to challenge the powers that be. They chose a side, and that side was liberation and self-determination. Our generation, on the other hand, has been taught a conformity style of activism that is counterproductive to Rodney's legacy. We are now taught how to attend meetings and allow ourselves to be brainwashed by our oppressors. We are now taught how to embrace silence, neutrality, objectivity on major issues that affect the majority of our people. We are taught how to compromise and betray our own interests by negotiating with those who have ill intentions for us. Young people and students, Rodney did not teach us silent activism. He has shown us how to critically analyze the major fractures in our system through understanding, unlearning what has been formally passed down through traditional norms and values, sharing insights and working together in teams to build more resilient communities. We can create social and economic opportunities within these communities to earn liberation and to face the fierce opposition from those who uphold capitalism. Without collective organizing and mobilization, we will remain powerless. Rodney's legacy of student activism is most evident in the student riots and protests in South Africa earlier this year, where Black university students protest against the hike in tuition fees and propose fairness on their behalf, as they have been groups that grapple with the negative effects of post-apartheid. The most paradoxical thing that I would say about my generation in Jamaica and the Caribbean by extension is that we know we deserve better. We know what the system and its agents are doing, but we fear the consequences of being labeled as rebels, being blacklisted, being labeled as a persona non grata, living without privileges and opportunities to have a better life, or even being assassinated like many before us, including Walter Rodney at the age of 37. Are we truly okay with the way things are? And how do we dismantle a system that thrives on our personal fears and insecurities? For members of the academia and the working class communities, I want to re-emphasize that academics and activism must be a mutual relationship. Any one element cannot be void of each other. Education must never be used as a tool to program people into what the system wants. but it must be used as a tool to inspire a different way of thinking, appreciating diversity in views, and empower people to maximize their fullest potential without strings attached and structural barriers. Currently in academia, content is being disseminated in a manner that is abstract of personal and collective experiences of people and society. Education is now geared towards earning profits and less concerned about the humanity of our people. It is less concerned with transferring theory into action, but more concerned with mummifying people's opinions and commodifying their identities. Here at the university, a student is primarily identified on the basis of his or her ID number, but not necessarily their name. Members of the academia, it is this phenomenon that Rodney alluded to when he spoke about the dehumanizing element of capitalism. And you have a responsibility to be either standard bearer for enlightenment and guidance to students, or be a puppet of the system. Any serious effort of consciousness raising and collective organization must see the importance of merging academics with activism, because without this, we will remain powerlessness. Academia and the working class communities should tap into expanding its numbers through alliances to harness economic cooperatives to ensure emancipation and a successful struggle against oppression. Capitalism cannot defeat capitalism. And by this I mean, we cannot use the belief systems and notions of capitalism to fight against the system. This is counterproductive. It was a black feminist by the name of Audre Lorde who said, "We cannot use the master's tool to dismantle the master's house." It is groups like We Change and the Tambourine Army that must be highly commended for connecting intellectual consciousness raising with extending its community work in rural, urban inner city areas and oppressed people to chart solutions instead of highlighting and identifying the existing problems. However, these are just a few examples. What can we do on a broader scale to enlighten and organize the masses by equipping them with skills and opportunities to fight in the bigger psychological warfare of capitalism? And what are the challenges that undermine these efforts from taking place? Members of the audience, as we reflect on the life and contribution of Dr. Walter Rodney, let us be encouraged to tread on the path of liberation fearlessly, but with calculated steps and decisions. Let us be encouraged to take sides in the struggle for self and collective emancipation, and not be condemned to a stance of hypocritical neutrality. And let us be encouraged to never allow the system to tear our songs from our throats. And let us be encouraged to never compromise on our personal politics while we ground with our brothers and sisters, just like what Brother Wally, also known as Dr. Walter Rodney, did. Long live the revolution, walk on.
Now, that is a student of the University of Jamaica. Excellent. I would like now to invite our panelists to join me on stage. Dean Waruko, Dr. Ajamu, Latoya Nugent, Dr. Naik, Sharon Oshun Harris Chambers, as well as Shazelle Rupert. Please join me. Yes, ma'am. Well, don't worry about it. Your one is one of the five. Yes. Each speaker will give a presentation of 15 minutes, after which we'll have an open question and answer section. Our first speaker will be our Dean of Humanities and Education, Professor Warren Boker, who is a professor of African social history. His research interest spans two main areas in West African history: the missionary involvement in African societies between 1865 and 1925, and the consequences of European trade and politics for African societies after the abolition of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. Rob.
Where do we go?
Right first.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir.
The lecture or the invitation that was sent to me by Jamu had specifically required of me to discuss the theme, advancing community economic development and self-emancipation in the humanities curriculum. And I believe he sees it as a subset of the overarching theme, which is Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation. So I tried to get a title for what I'm about to do now, and it runs like this: Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation, advancing community economic development and self-emancipation in the humanities curriculum. The symposium, as we now know, and as well represented by the young lady, I'm so proud of you, who spoke just a while ago, is designed to celebrate not just the scholastic prowess of Walter Rodney, but also, and more importantly, his political activism. Even as we seek to examine the overarching theme that brings into focus one of the most globally celebrated black activists, the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And this is a quote that represents the overarching theme, Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation today. I'd like to draw your attention to the phrase economic emancipation today. And I also like to draw your attention to the specific theme that I've been advised to discuss, which is advancing community economic development and self-emancipation in the humanities. So let us bear these two things in mind as I seek to establish the relationship. The thematic as well as scholastic relationship between the two. But I try to contextualize it globally, and I try to frame it with reference to concepts that have shaped power relations globally. This very laudable overarching scholastic aim of the symposium invites me, and I assume invites you as well, to examine the issues that we will raise this evening from a political economy perspective. This is because the socioeconomic and political problems, and I assume that when we refer to community, for immediate understanding, we would like to refer to Jamaica. So the community that I constantly refer to, for purposes of this discussion, will be Jamaica. and its neighbors in the wide Caribbean. And I think that, similar to all erstwhile colonial and underdeveloped African and Latin American countries, the problems that we see in Jamaica, economic problems, socioeconomic problems, the problems that would demand for us to re-examine whether or not we've achieved self-emancipation, whether or not we are developing or developed, are traceable to the colonial past, as well as to the current post-colonial situation within the global capitalist system. I will address the global capitalist system bearing in mind how Walter Rodney himself perceived of it and sought to frame the global capitalist system and its consequences not just on power relations between the developing countries and the developed countries, but also between developing countries and in the relations of production between the developed and developed countries and between classes within developed countries. This system promotes and sustains inequality in the economic relationship between the erstwhile colonial countries and the industrialized economies. Post-colonial studies in the social sciences and the humanities, it should be noted from the very outset, and this is my remit, have been contributing immensely to our understanding of the evolving international division of labor, what the young lady was referring to, that is largely responsible for the unequal economic power relations and economic relations, have largely to do with the international division of labor that started slightly earlier than the slave trade itself, got the main trajectories of the relationship mapped up during the transatlantic slave trade, got consolidated during the period after the transatlantic slave trade, but in the so-called legitimate commerce, and got continued during the colonial period when it really got intensified and took on the present forms that we know of it, where it is perpetuated through the World Bank, through the IMF, through the bilateral and multilateral loans that we very willingly accept as a result of our impoverished conditions, without necessarily realizing that all of these compound the already complicated relations of production that has kept us in the condition that we see. I'll, as I get along, address the question of true and false consciousness, which the lady referred to, but which we sometimes do not realize that what we project as knowledge is in fact an expression of false consciousness. But we don't realize it. The most disturbing aspect of it is that even when we are told, we doggedly maintain that it is not. The evolving exploitative character of the present global division of labor and the ideological and political systems underpinning that process have steadily continued to widen and exacerbate the technological divide and the iniquitous unequal power relations between the poor, underdeveloped, and the rich, developed countries of the world. This symposium, under the well spelled out aforementioned overarching theme, may in fact, knowingly or unknowingly, I put it that way because there is nothing in the advert itself that would have made this immediately obvious, reflecting on the North-South dialogue. She talked about the South and never referred to the North. But in terms of these power relations, you cannot conceive of the South without conceiving of the North. The North represents the developed, and the South represents the developing or the underdeveloped. And so what we are in fact doing in this room is to reflect on the North-South divide. The ideological, the economic, the political, and the cultural underpinnings of that divide. That's what we are in fact doing. So what we are in fact doing is reflecting on wider global issues. And it is in this sense that Walter Rodney was a scholar whose reach, whose impact was global. This also in this sense that Marcus Garvey, who without necessarily engaging in the theoretical basis for understanding this problem in the way Walter Rodney did, provided in a very practical way the type of education, the type of data that made possible for people like Walter Rodney to do the work that they did. What I'm signaling to you is that Marcus Garvey in many ways represented one of the forerunners of this type of consciousness. He may not have expressed it in the form in which Walter Rodney had done, which was suited for the academic audience. But he was actually articulating the type of consciousness, and through the global political movement that he had formed, actually provided the data that made possible the levels of analysis which people like Walter Rodney were to later embark upon. This symposium therefore seeks to interrogate how the global discursive and ideological systems locate the human being as labor. What the International Division of Labor does, and what the North-South relationship does, is that it sees you, it sees me as a commodity. It commodifies. Once you have commodified labor, you take a different view to it. And you indicate the kind of production relations that thereafter, that commodification of labor allows you to pursue. And within the capitalist framework, the ultimate aim is profit maximization. That is the ultimate aim. For capital to reproduce itself, it must exploit. There is no way out of it. For capital to reproduce itself, it must exploit. And it must seek new areas to invest. And the only way in which it can seek new areas to invest is to exploit available labor in order to achieve the surplus, in order to invest in new areas. There is an insatiable desire for profit maximization. That is possible only because capitalism does not appreciate your social value. It appreciates your labor value. Locate the human being as labor, a member of a workforce. So I belong to a workforce. You are hoping to belong to a workforce. Or a factor of production. You are a factor of production. Now if you accept it, then you can understand what the system is about. A factor of production in the economy, eclipsing efforts to empower people as citizens to act individually or collectively for broader social change and political change. As some of us might already know, the purpose of the unending North-South dialogue, among other things, is to close or eliminate the yawning technological gap between the rich and poor nations of the world. It is clear to me from the overarching theme that this symposium might be seeking answers to a number of related fundamental philosophical questions. Is education, I'm returning to my remit now, is education primarily, quote, intended to empower people as citizens to act individually or collectively for broader social and political change? Or is education simply intended to prepare you and me as a factor of production? Is education after social consciousness, the type of social consciousness that does not place premium on you as a factor of production? If so, what type of social and political change do we seek through curricular development in our educational institutions such as the UWI? What kind of education? That is what they asked me to do. What kind of education do we provide to be able to engender, to generate in you the kind of social consciousness that allows you to make the distinction between seeing yourself as a factor of production and seeing yourself as somebody with a certain degree of social consciousness capable of bringing about social change. Social change that is intended to bring about development. Development as freedom. Freedom as development. Because education, as I will come to later discuss, ought to be the practice of freedom. If education is not the practice of freedom, the purpose of education, the cardinal purpose of education is defeated. And that is when we will begin to examine the question of true and false consciousness. And whether or not we are going through a kind of curricula in the humanities and social science that can help us identify the sometimes very dim boundaries between what might appear as true consciousness, but is indeed false consciousness. We also ask the question, what is more important, vocational skills or the arts? Some aspects of university education simply allows you to know how to put things together. You know, two pieces of wood, you bring it together, you knock it together, you sell, you make money. Then some aspects of university education is after your consciousness. Which one is more important? What is more important is one aspect of the debate about what education really is. Which one is more important? It's actually one aspect of the conversation as to what education really is. Is education about the social person, or is education intended to prepare you as a factor of production? And all that I'm saying today is also part of the crusade that I have embarked upon, the question of the relevance of the humanities. We are in a society today where, because we need to put two pieces of wood together to make a table to sell, we no longer think about the tableness of it. We are more concerned about the table, not the tableness of the table. So we don't think. We don't think. And so we are more interested in going to those areas where we can put the two pieces of wood together to make the table to sell. And that is not related to the wider issues about our being and beingness. As economic being, we need vocational skills to put money in our pockets, that's true, as well as food in our stomachs, that's also true. But as reflective human beings, we also need the humanities and the social sciences to put ideas, including abstract ideas, in our heads. Because that is what makes the human being. What makes the human being is not a capacity to put two pieces of wood together to make a table, without understanding the tableness of it. You are a factor of production, mere labor. And so you can be exploited in that kind of way. You belong to a low level of social consciousness. You may not admit it. And it's understandable if you don't admit it. But that is what you are. That is what you are. You consume, you are a consumer. That is what capitalism makes you to be. You are a consumer. To the extent that you consume and consume, you feel you are doing well. The more you consume, the more you want to consume. Consumerism. That is what capitalism makes us to be. The disciplines collectively making up the humanities and social sciences have provided the theoretical tools for both understanding and democratizing discourses relating to the questions posed above. As a student of society myself, I'm fully convinced that an interrogation of the global discursive and ideological systems that locate the human being as mere labor will inevitably require and engage the insights of the related disciplines within the social sciences and the humanities. Remember, what I'm speaking to is advancing community economic development and self-emancipation in the humanities curriculum. That's my remit. Remember that all the time. As the effects of globalization change, and I dare to say, also distort our international horizons, some people, and many people, are getting more and more accustomed to thinking that the underdeveloped members of the international, that the underdeveloped peoples, such as we are in this part of the world, are members of an international community. So we are a globalized community. So we are simply members of that community. What that perception means is that if we are simply members of that international community, then if it is possible to reproduce what has happened in those places here, we will be like those places. This kind of reasoning completely obscures the fundamental causes of your underdevelopment. It completely obscures and allows you to develop that false consciousness that the lady was talking about. And it sees the impoverished countries as merely the underdeveloped regions of the international economy. This flawed and simplistic reasoning is that if we all belong to one community, if we all belong to one globalized community, then apparently the problems of these underdeveloped and impoverished countries within the global plan cannot be much different from that of the backward areas or regions of of any particular thriving and wealthy industrialized economies or country. When globalization initially began and the anti-globalization movements, which had died down recently, but only sporadically flares up from point to point when there are major issues, exactly reflects what I am saying. The idea is you are part of a globalized environment. So if you are part of that globalized environment, it is then simply to say that you are simply the underdeveloped part of that globalized environment, and over time, you'll be able to look like the globalized environment, the developed part of the globalized environment. On the basis of this flawed reasoning, the idea has emerged that the foreign investor is as good a means for achieving technological progress in an underdeveloped economy. So you don't worry about indigenizing technology. You bring the foreign investor. To the extent that the foreign investor is coming, the so-called expatriate, you are okay. Because by the expatriate coming, you believe that there will be transfer of technology. What is clear is that after 70 years of independence, after 50 years of independence, the presence of the foreign investor has neither indigenized technology nor has it transferred technology. In fact, the foreign investor will never transfer technology because that is not his mandate. That is not the mandate. That can't happen. We have to be able to originate and indigenize the technology to be able to compete, to be able to internalize it. I'll leave this section of the paper. I understand I have just 5 minutes more. I want to look at what is true education and what is not true education, because that is the second part of what I want to talk about. I hope you will allow me some additional 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Education and creative intellectual activity. This is the next section of it. Karl Marx could justifiably be described as the founding father, among other accolades, of the discipline now known as sociology of knowledge. Most of us think that knowledge is innocent. Most of us think so. Most of us think actually that 1 plus 1 is 2. At a higher level of reasoning, 1 plus 1 may not necessarily be 2. When I say to you, I have conducted a research and this is my result, you assume that because a professor is talking, indeed that is the case. I am only talking from a particular perspective, and to the extent that you understand my perspective, so would you appreciate my results. If you don't understand my perspective, and therefore place my results in context, I am likely to lead you in a direction that you wouldn't necessarily know. And this is part of the business of false consciousness and true consciousness. So it is not always enough to see a professor or any goddamn person from wherever the person comes to say, this is what I found. I have come to solve your economic problems, and this is the situation as it is. And you believe that that might indeed be the case, because he's a professor from somewhere coming, he's a financial analyst from somewhere coming, he's an engineer from somewhere coming. The experience that he is selling through the process is a social product. Knowledge is a social product. And it can only be understood as such. That is what is known as epistemology. In academic discussions, it's known as epistemology, and it is part of the sociology of knowledge. To be able to understand what anybody is doing, what anybody is saying, you need to understand the sociological foundations of what the person is saying. Otherwise, you are likely to believe that what we say is empirical is indeed empirical because it is infallible. It is now no longer possible, except among obscurantists and incorrigible students of human society, to uphold the patently flawed Hegelian notion, wrapped up in the mystifying system that ideas, whether the pure or absolute idea, or the so-called world spirit, constitute the basis of social reality, which in turn amounts to the dim reflection of the dialectically changing character of these autonomous, self-generating, and self-perpetuating ideas. Apart from the seminal work of Marx and Friedrich Engels, which explicitly placed ideas and concepts in the contextual social setting in which they germinate, grow into false or true consciousness, and are translated into action or stifled by society, several other scholars have come to place varying degrees of emphasis on the relationship between ideas and social context. That emphasis has been determined in part by the competing ideological perspectives of the scholars involved in the debate on the sociology of knowledge. This was Walter Rodney's lifetime engagement. If you understand Walter Rodney beyond the narrative, if you understand how the narrative is framed, this is how the narrative is framed. Walter Rodney was essentially contesting the epistemological foundation of colonial studies, according to which some people are primitive and some people are civilized. Some people are developed and some people are underdeveloped rather than developing. If you read Walter Rodney just on the surface, you might enjoy it because it's a narrative that is smooth sailing. But the message is far stronger and deeper than that. And the only way you understand that is to be able to understand the sociological foundations of what the narrative was saying or is saying. However, setting aside ideological interpretations in debates about sociology of knowledge, the general view is that the ideas and values underpinning knowledge production, and we have to include, this is humanities and education. So I decided to address the question of STEM. I don't know how many of you are in education there. I decided to include the idea of STEM. It's a much longer paper, I can't have all the time to deal with it, but I'll just offer a few thoughts and ask a few questions and perhaps ask you to answer rather than asking you to answer them. This would include the idea of STEM education in this category. Are ultimately meaningful and significant only when they are situated appropriately in their socio-historical context. So this new idea of STEM that they are selling up as a way of bridging the technological gap, which we do not interrogate but simply accept. We do not interrogate them because we do not want to challenge the sociological foundations of it. Because if we do, we are going to offend the imperial powers, who, for instance, have had to pay for the STEM curriculum and are now exporting it because it's part of the overriding way, intellectually, of sustaining the international division of labor and the global system that has placed us where we are. is one good reason why education must be indigenized for sustainable development and freedom. In the economic development process of underdeveloped countries, including the development of academic curricula in the universities, planners have often behaved as if the conditions in their countries were similar to those in Europe or America. The conditions here were never similar to those of Europe. We initially inherited the British curriculum. It's been indigenized. There was a time they denied that there was anything ever called West Indian literature, African history. Then at some point when it became clear that it was West Indian literature, we had to import concepts to justify whatever we consider as West Indian literature or West Indian history or African history. Consequently, they have often made the mistake of engaging in the wholesale importation or transfer of ideas and expertise from the advanced industrialized countries in pursuit of their own development. This is the critical part too I want to emphasize because of my remit. Education is a socializing force. Let us know that and appreciate it. Education is a socializing force. It could either serve for human freedom or it could serve for human domestication and enslavement. You students should accept that. Education can either serve as a vehicle for your freedom or it can serve as a vehicle for your domestication. This is part of what she was saying. And this was part of what Marcus Garvey was saying when he talks about self-emancipation, which Bob Marley was saying. Sometimes we misplace what is meant by self-emancipation. We misplace it. And when we misplace it, we fall into the trap of false consciousness. But we don't even know it. Educational systems are designed to function as props to a given society, and the educated in the young age groups automatically carry over values when their own time comes to make decisions in society. The main purpose of the colonial school system, for example, was to train the colonized populations to help man the local administrations at the lowest ranks and to staff the private capitalist firms owned by Europeans. Because too much learning was deemed to be superfluous and dangerous for the colonized population, secondary education was rare, and other forms of higher education were virtually non-existent throughout most of the colonial era. Genuine technical education was equally ruled out, because the fundamental purpose of colonial economy did not permit the development of industry, indigenous entrepreneurs, and skills within the colonized territories. In the end, colonial pedagogy largely produced persons for the preservation of colonial relations after the attainment of independence. The post-colonial state was simply, in very many respects, a perpetuation of the colonial relations of production. One set out, one set in, the same thing existed. This is part of the self-emancipation that we are talking about. And the only way it can begin to happen and happen seriously is the real conscientization of society through an indigenized educational system that takes account of local situations rather than what happens elsewhere as the basis of self-development. The second aspect of the remit tells me about advancing community development. The first part of it talks about advancing community development. Bullet 4 of the paper that I was given says, you intend to organize collective economic development project. How do you organize collective economic development project when there isn't the basic notion of who am I? What am I engaged in this for? And for who? Until that level of self-emancipation is achieved, we will continue to suffer the basic problem of not being able to realize what exactly it is that we are pursuing. And any group that does not understand what exactly it is that they are pursuing are trapped in false consciousness. You may not accept it, but you are trapped in false consciousness. And so you make the wrong decisions. You pitch your attacks at the wrong individuals because you do not have a clear consciousness as to where the problem lies and how these problems can be resolved. The situation today Kwame Nkrumah calls it neocolonialism, continues in various shades and forms in the erstwhile colonial territories of the world. It is perpetuated, as I said, by the multinational and transnational corporations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and many of all of these other things that we do through education. Education either functions as an instrument to facilitate the integration of people into the logic of the present global exploitative capitalist system, and thereby bring about conformity to it. That is the point we are making. Or it becomes the practice of freedom. Or it becomes the practice of freedom. So what are we doing here in the humanities? That's the question you are asking. What are we doing here in the humanities? How do we as program designers carry with us this consciousness into the kinds of programs that we design and deliver? How do we as university administrators in countries that have been through the kind of historical experience that we are addressing today, carry with us this kind of consciousness? How do we as leaders of the state called Jamaica carry with us this kind of consciousness that we are talking about in the kind of social policies that we design? And since education is a socializing force, how does the state incorporate and encourage the education system? This throws open the whole question of the debate which I saw in its fiercest form in my early years of arrival in this country 23 years ago, when the debate about the incorporation of Garveyism into the school curriculum was a tough fight. Why must it take the fight to have it in? What was wrong with it? Because it carried with it those liberating elements that would immediately indicate the injustices of the status quo. That is what it is. That is what it is. Then it took several decades of a slow acceptance, gradual acceptance, until it got to the point where today, seemingly, those who did not live during the time the debate was on wouldn't appreciate what it took to have even that in the school curriculum. That is the curriculum thing we were referring to. But even before that had happened, because the university has institutional accreditation, they could run courses of that kind. And because the university is supposed to be enjoying academic autonomy, it could run courses of that kind. But it could not get into the school system where you need to catch the young ones very early on. So generations earlier went through the school system without the kind of consciousness that would have been necessary to serve them. And those generations are the generations that are ruling the country until now. And it will take quite a while before the generations that began having the benefit of the curriculum change begin to rule society. Education as practice of freedom is the means by which people deal critically and creatively with their reality, and also discover how to participate effectively as citizens, not as factors of production. As citizens in the transformation of their own country and their worldviews. Much of what I say on some of it, I derive from this very transformative university lecturer and activist, Paulo Freire, in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you're able to find that book, sit down and read it for yourself. And you would see, and you would see how his thinking coincides with that of Walter Rodney and coincides in various ways with that of Marcus Garvey. True education, as an authentic act of knowing, is the only means of generating true consciousness. And human beings are capable of engaging in true education. So no human being is wasted. Why? Because the human being, unlike the animal, is the only creation that can reflect and reflect on his or her reflection. Bear in mind what I just said. The human being, nobody is wasted. is the one that can reflect and can distance himself or herself from that reflection and reflect on that initial reflection. That is the capacity of the human being as different from the lower beings. That is why it is possible that you can go from false consciousness to true consciousness. And it is this basic thing that should make you not to lose faith in humanity. If the revolution has to come, one day it will come. But it may not come now. But it may come because there is somebody who has thoroughly gone through this process, believing in humanity, and believing that through the organization that is put in place, you can encourage others to reflect on their reflection and move away from false consciousness to true consciousness, even as you debate what is false consciousness and true consciousness as you proceed. I will close now. It is precisely because human beings can problematize and re-problematize by perceiving their perceptions in order to recreate their hidden realities that this symposium is seeking to interrogate how the global discursive and ideological systems locate the human being as labor, quote unquote, mere labor, a member of the workforce, a factor of production in the economy, eclipsing efforts to empower people as citizens to act individually or collectively to broaden social and political change. The humanities and the social sciences provide the analytical and critical skills for true education and knowing. Sometimes we think we know it, but when you ask the individual, how do you know that you know? That is when you know that that individual does not know. That's a fact. Sometimes we think we know, and we present ourselves as knowing. It is when you engage the individual and say to the individual, how do you know that you know? The individual may even get irritated. But until you ask yourself at every critical juncture, it seems to me I know. But how do I know that I know? This is how you can begin to engage in that process of self-liberation. The humanities and the social sciences provide the analytical and critical skills for true education and knowing, which involves the dialectical movement that goes from action to reflection and from reflection upon action to a new action. That is the dialectic process. That is the dialectic process. It's being presented in this way, but we do it all the time. Some of us fall short, depending on your level of consciousness and depending on the extent to which you can detach yourself from your reality and reflect on the reflections of that reality that you thought you knew so well. My view of creative intellectual activity, as I stand in front of you, does not encompass all intellectual exercises resulting in learned publications. What I'm saying to you is this: I'm criticizing myself. It's not because I write whatever it is that my CV says I write, doesn't mean that I'm educated. There are men and women who have not written as much, but whose level of social consciousness and identification of the issues that bother society are far stronger, resolute, articulate than I myself. That is why sometimes it is said, you have to go to the people. That is why it is sometimes said that you have to go to the people. So, where do I close? I close by simply reproducing what has been something that we learned right from undergraduate college to postgraduate college, and now that we're lecturers. And it's a quote from Karl Marx. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. The point, however, is to change it. It is not enough that I speak to you all this big grammar, and that is where Walter Rodney is different. He went into the trenches. And that is where Marcus Garvey set the pace. He took the bull by the horns. Much of us, many of us, remain in the air-conditioned classrooms and preach all the theories. Philosophers have interpreted the world in different ways. The most important thing is to change it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that thought-provoking start of our presentations. I now invite Dr. Ajamu Nanwaya, who is a writer and organizer and educator. He is currently a lecturer in the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies. He has a doctorate in adult education and community development from the University of Toronto. He has been active in the Canadian labor movement around equality and class struggle issues, and was a former vice president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. He engages in journalistic activism in speaking truth to power and the powerless. Dr. Ajal.
Thank you, Dr. Comrade Shelley, and thanks to all the comrades who came before, Comrade Tina and Comrade Bean or Boca. We've set the basis or the condition for the issues that I'll be engaged in. I'm looking at the theme of my discussion is this is not Marcus Garvey's approach to economic development, labor self-management, and African liberation. We're speaking in the context of the annual Walter Rodney lecture. And Walter Rodney was someone who admired Marcus Garvey immensely for his work, his contribution to African liberation. And I'm going to take a quote from his book, from Rodney's book, The Groundings with My Brothers, where he made a comment on Garvey. Marcus Garvey was one of the first advocates of black power, and is still today the greatest spokesman ever to have been produced by the movement of black consciousness. A race without authority and power is a race without respect, wrote Marcus Garvey. He spoke to all Africans on the earth, whether they lived in Africa, South America, the West Indies, or North America, and he made blacks aware of their strength when united. The late revolutionary intellectual Pan-Africanist and communist Walter Rodney quite rightly recognized the role of Marcus Garvey in advancing the cause of African liberation on a global scale, and also exposing the fact that white supremacy is operational as a worldwide system of oppression, or downpression, as Rastafari would say. Further, Rodney states that Garvey always preached the value of African history and culture. He wrote that, quoting Garvey, for many years, white propagandists have been printing tons of literature to impress scattered Ethiopia, especially that portion within their civilization, with the idea that Africa is a despised place, inhabited by savages and cannibals, where no civilized human beings should go, end of quote. It goes without saying that Garvey exposed and dismissed the self-interested and self-serving motives behind the racist characterization of Africa and Africans. The research of Garvey scholars such as Rupert Lewis and the late Tony Martin have made clear that Garvey was a champion of Africans and articulated ideas around African redemption that are still relevant today. You may read their books and that of other pro-Garvey scholars to get a full understanding of Marcus Garvey and his work. I am particularly interested in Garvey's embrace of capitalism as that political stance it relates to an economic program of liberation for Africans in the 21st century and beyond. When many of us look at Garvey's economic program, we do not think that Garvey was a pro-capitalist and I should add an anti-communist. It was very explicit in that. And as we have heard from two previous speakers, Comrade Dean, Warburg, and Comrade Tina, capitalism is a non-starter. Capitalism is a non-starter. So besides the robust and militant advocacy of African self-love and self-determination, Marcus Garvey is probably best known for his race-centered vision and his practice of business development and entrepreneurship by Africans and for Africans on the African continent and the diaspora. A part of Garvey's Garveyism foundational inspiration may be traced to the program of the conservative and arguably the father of black capitalism, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington. And I'm assuming, are there a lot of people here who are aware of who is Booker T. Washington guy was? Okay. Today we'll probably call him an Uncle Tom in terms of his economic vision. It's probably more complex than that, but he's usually thrown in that category because of his approach to politics and economics. Both Garvey and Washington were strong advocates of the belief that the development of an extensive economic base is the foundation for the acquisition of political power. And so the reason why Booker T. Washington, located in the South, a man who was born in slavery and served in slavery as a child, got emancipated, left Virginia, went to Tuskegee, Alabama, where he developed an educational institution that is still around. It's Tuskegee, from Tuskegee Institute to now Tuskegee University. But he believed in industrial education instead of a more classic liberal arts education, and that wasn't threatening to white supremacy in the American South. He thinks that let's build our economic base, and then when we develop wealth, we'll be respected by the forces of white supremacy. We'll be accepted into their house. Other people took a different position. So unfortunately, both Garvey and Washington embraced existing economic system, capitalism, as the most effective instrument for the development of economic security and empowerment of the African race. According to Garvey, capitalism is necessary for the and I'm quoting him on this, you can find this in Garvey's The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. Garvey said that capitalism is necessary to the progress of the world, and those who unreasonably and wantonly oppose or fight against it are enemies of human development. That's Marcus Garvey. In spite of Rodney's admiration of the racial liberation ethic of the organizing legacy of Garvey, he would have take exception to the largely positive way that Garvey framed capitalism as a positive force in and for human development and progress. In the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Rodney, the revolutionary intellectual and activist, had this to say about capitalism and what it is for those of us who are from the laboring class, the sufferers, those of us who come from the dirty. Garvey said the peasants and workers of Europe and eventually the inhabitants of the old world paid a huge price so that the capitalists could make their profits from human labor that always lies behind the machine. That contradicts other facets of development, especially viewed from the standpoint of those who suffered and still suffer to make capitalist achievements possible. This latter group are the majority of humanity. He said man, but I said humanity. He would have used inclusive gender language today in 2017. I hope so. To advance, they must overthrow capitalism that we're talking about, those of us who are suffering the ill effects of capitalism. To advance, they must overthrow capitalism, and that is why at the moment, capitalism stands in the path of further human development. To put it another way, the social class relations of capitalism are now outmoded, and just as slavery and feudal relations became outmoded in their time, so is capitalism. But why would Marcus Garvey, given his commitment to learning and reading, embrace such an economic system? Why? Because, you read Garvey's word and you're thinking, wow, this brother didn't go through the university system, but his education and his thought are advanced, are more advanced than many people, or most people who went through the university or spent time or did time on the academic plantation. I believe Garvey's race-first philosophy and practice compromises ability to cite up the fact that his capitalistic ideological commitments and prejudices, when operationalized in its desired African empire, would lead to the domination and exploitation of the African working class. Because if you have a vision of the world, it can prevent you, and if you have certain values, it can prevent you from seeing the truth, even when it's in front of your head, in front of your eyes. While when we look at people like Bob Marley and Rodney, they were able to cite up the reality of this Babylonian system of capitalism as a blood-sucking vampire. Bob Marley sang about it in Babylon system. They were able to see that, but not Garvey. Garvey wasn't able to observe or to appreciate the oppressive character of capitalism. So, the thing about Garvey, he recognized that there must be some limitations on the extent of ownership under capitalism, where he said an individual should own more than $1 million worth of assets, and a company shouldn't own more than $5 million. But today, we're talking about $1 million in investment and $5 million. That's a small potato. Garvey would have to change. Another aspect of Garveyism, and you can find that in his philosophy, the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. Garvey also advocates what C.L.R. James would call state capitalism. State capitalism is practiced in Jamaica, is practiced in the United States, because recently when we had the Great Recession, we see the intervention of the capitalist state to stabilize capitalism. It's more pronounced in Cuba, in China, in North Korea, in terms of the state acting as the capitalist to further economic development. Garvey believed in a developmental state that can also even appropriate the resources without compensation of the capitalist, but they're using the state to advance capitalist developmental goals. Because Garvey is committed to capitalism as an economic system. One thing must be very clear to us, and at least it's clear to me as someone who spent a number of years living in the imperialist center of North America, is that capitalism even exploits white people, the white working class. But white supremacy is used to make the condition of white workers a little better so that they identify with their white slave masters instead of the working class in its diversity, racially, sexually, gender-wise, based on the different range of ability. Race is used as that divider. And in the same way that we have a debate going on in Jamaica that I see as an ideologically backward debate about Chinese investment in Jamaica. People who don't talk about economic issues have an opinion on Chinese capitalism in Jamaica. They don't criticize American capitalism operating in Jamaica. I don't hear them criticizing Canadian capitalism in Jamaica or British capitalism in Jamaica, but there's something about Chinese capitalism that gets us excited. Instead of being identified with the Chinese workers who come to Jamaica and are exploited by their capitalist bosses, we are identified with our local Jamaican capitalists who want a bigger share of the pie and don't want the competition from the Chinese. So the ROPO scheme, those of us who are sufferers, those of us who, when we're working for the Jamaican capitalists, will exploit us and treat us like dogs. And nobody can talk about that more than domestic workers who have to work in the homes as these petty bourgeois elements and how they treat them. And will keep at every penny that they can from working class women. Or those of us who work in the service sector outside of the homes for African capitalists. During the early days of the development of reggae music, people like Dupree, Coxon, Dodd, they use racial solidarity to encourage African singers to come and work with them. But they were more exploitative of African singers than even the Chinese record producers. You can look at the story of Bob Marley. But they use race to try to mobilize poor people to identify with their masters. That is what would have happened if we follow economic Garveyism that is based on the ideological foundation of capitalism. We have to move away from that. Because you look in the United States and you look at the level of income concentration and wealth concentration, the most of the wealth belongs to whites who don't give a damn about the condition of the white working class. But they will mobilize them, as we see Trump did, to work against racialized people who are poor. And the poor are just at each other's neck, rather than we develop the level of class consciousness necessary so that we can work to overthrow capitalism and all other forms of oppression. When I talk about even, I look at identity politics and I look at the different groups that are exploited in society. If it's women, I don't give a damn about petty bourgeois women. I'm interested in the condition of working class women. If I look at queers, I look at the condition of how lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual brothers and sisters who are working class. Because the petty bourgeois queer and the petty bourgeois woman and the petty bourgeois person who are disabled will support the system of oppression that rob them, that suck the blood, the tears, the life from the people who are part of the working class. Class struggle is very important to the liberation. So when we talk about class, we're talking about all the people in their diversity who share working class commitment. And if you're petty bourgeois, don't feel you're left out, because Amilcar Cabral, the great revolutionary from Guinea-Bissau, offered you the option of committing class suicide. That you forsake the economic advantages of being a part of capitalism and identify 100% with the working class. And if you think that a petty bourgeois, at least radicalized and revolutionary petty bourgeois, is not central to the struggles, since 1789, no, except for the Mexican Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, all national liberation struggles and social revolution have been led by the revolutionary petty bourgeois. There are certain skills and knowledge that they have, that if they turn it to the cause of African liberation, like Walter Rodney, like Claudia Jones, like Angela Davis, like many people who have forsaken the economic interest to identify the workers, things can change. I'm just going to briefly, in just 1 minute, talk about the alternative. We can develop a program of cooperative economic development in Jamaica in the 1970s. We produce an example to the world of the possibilities of workers not being workers, but being humans who control and manage their workplace. As imperfect as that example was, the sugar worker cooperatives in Jamaica, it showed that working class people, if provided the knowledge and the skills and a changed consciousness, can manage and own their workplace. If we don't want to be a factor of production, then we can start to organize on that basis. Some people are complaining and say, okay, the businesses are being owned by Chinese and other forces. We don't need a wholesale to be owned by capitalists. The workers can go and own it. The supermarkets that are here, they can be owned and managed and controlled by us, the consumers. Many of us are complaining, Fitz Jackson, one of the leading forces in Jamaica, about all the blood-sucking vampires that we call banks are robbing people blind. We have credit unions that are owned and controlled by us, the members, but instead we take our money and deposit it in capitalist banks. Credit unions offer loans, they offer student loans and other forms of loans. We don't need capitalist banks. Why are we financing our own oppression? We need an alternative approach, and I believe that traditional African values that are associated with non-state formations can rescue us. It provides values around mutual aid, solidarity, empathy, care, These are what we need. We don't need the dog-eat-dog values of capitalism, the greed, the self-centeredness, the selfishness of capitalism. That is destroying us in many ways. And I'm just going to close on this note, and I can elaborate on the economic possibilities because of worker self-management and cooperative economic development as a transitional way out of capitalism. One group in Caribbean, and it's now a global force, that has a concept, Untitled, the Rastafari, that we can draw ideas from Untitled to use it to deal with the ecological challenges in the Caribbean. And right now my students, my Culture of Rastafari course, this is what they're exploring for their final essay, is how can Untitled be applied to Caribbean development or Pan-African economic or social development and liberation. It can address economic questions because a part of Untitled is Rastafari's commitment to the non-commodification of land. Land shouldn't be treated as something that's bought and sold. Land should be available based on your use for it. You know, and there are other things in terms of how people relate, and even the idea of the reasoning circle, it can provide us with some guides to a different type of political relationship. But of course, we have to challenge the patriarchal ideas that are in Rastafari. There's a Rasta named Ras Aishan, and he articulated the idea that Rastafari is against all forms of down oppression without exception. So that means that Rastafari should be for feminist revolution as well as Rastafari should be queer positive and support the liberation of all oppressed people. Comrades, thank you. And you can ask questions later.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ajamu. My job here is to steer you through these conversations. And it's very hard because I have it writing from Ajamu. Shelley, keep me to the 15 minutes. And you realize what he said to me. Give me a few more minutes. So we have a set of panelists who are very passionate about talking about Marcus Garvey and economic emancipation today. And now let me invite Sharon Oshun Paris Chambers, Deputy Coordinator of the Pan-African Federalist Movement, international publicist, as well as author.
Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope I'll be loud enough to be heard. I'm a soft-spoken person. I want to recognize the Dean, Mabinte Wariboko, Dr. Adamu Nangwaya Kanamawi Knife, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be speaking of, my topic is Africa, a sovereign nation united and totally emancipated. That's where we want to go. Part of my presentation will be skewed towards the Pan-African Federalist movement, as you see I'm a member. In honor of Walter Rodney, freedom fighter for justice, empowerment, and equality, the people's advocate, I refer to this excerpt from a review of the African Political Economy by Horace Campbell. One of the most politically intelligent opponents of the regime has been removed. A prophet of the self-emancipation of the working people has been silenced. And that was on Friday, the 13th of June, 1980. A partisan of the liberation of all people is no more. The WPA and his comrade in arms will carry on his work. Indeed. In fact, 35,000 people attended that funeral on the 23rd of June, and the Burham regime threatened workers who participated. Yet they followed behind the horse-drawn couples singing and showing condemnation for the cowardly acts. Yes, Walter Rodney will live forever, wherever and whenever men and women stand up and fight injustice. Some of you have in your hands the call for the first Pan-African Federalist Congress, which was made 2 years ago. On this document, do you have it there with you? Some of you have it. It's a one-page document. It shows the map of Africa and her states. Well, this document is asking us and getting us ready to make a decision. Are you ready to sign or say yes to a referendum at this first Pan-African Pre-Congress or Congress when it comes? And it asks, do you believe that the political unification of the African states is a matter of utmost urgency for Africans on the continent and the diaspora? And do you agree with Kwame Nkrumah when he said that, well, it is clear that we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can be found only in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good of the world. We further believe that the need, or it's asking, do you believe the need for a strong African state that can demand for and expect to get the repatriation of the wrongs that has been done to Africans through slavery and colonialism? So what we're asking you is, if you agree to any of the above and further questions on the page, please complete the form and give it to the gentleman in the black in the front, Mr. Imhotep Ashanti. Ladies and gentlemen, how long will Africa and its diaspora carry the stigma of disunity and underdevelopment? The 21st century has been called 20th century, 21st century called time for African Renaissance, a time to reclaim our sovereignty. Samuel Nkrumah, who is just here on the island, he left today, asserts a resurgence of Nkrumism. The Pan-African Federalists, of which she's a part, are actively campaigning in 20 African states and the diaspora for unification of African states. This is called Pan-African Federalism. States are required to give up some of their autonomy to a central government which will protect and manage their sovereignty. You've heard something similar before, called the United States of America, but we are the United African States. We are including the continent and its diaspora. Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation will underpin my presentation, and I might add, in the same way Garvey's philosophy and writings inspired and rekindled African nationalism in Ghana and Pan-Africanism the world over, evidence in books and speeches by Kwame Nkrumah, as in Africa Unite and others, Walter Rodney, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Malcolm X, and the music of Robert Nesta Marley, and the words, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our mind. The philosophy of Garvey, I think, can be found everywhere in the world, and much of it is written or etched on many of our hearts and our minds. I have a 10-point, I'm sure I may not get through all of them, but the presentation invitation to speak is looking for a practice of economic emancipation today. And I'm proposing here a capacity to implement our own core programs within a union of states. In the core focus of the Pan-African Federalist movement, here we are moving from dependency to true emancipation. Recently we were told by Donald Trump in his address to the UN that his advocacy is for America to do what is in its best interest. And therefore I say to you, Africa should do what is in the best interest of Africa. Empowering our people, a grassroots coalition, aware of their human and social capital, committed to revolutionary change. This is being cultivated within the African diaspora as we speak. It's a bottom-up push that will deliver African sovereignty back to the people. We are told today by one of the speakers, earlier speaker, we must extrapolate wisdom from the grassroots, from the foundation, Dr. Dowse. We must not pretend as though we have all the answers. The Garvey model of steamship luxury liners owned and operated by Africans is a dire necessity today to rechart the seaworthy course of traveling to Africa. Imagine, from Barbados, it's a straight course to the Horn. of Africa. Why do we need, next, why do we need a visa to go to Africa? Salmon Nkrumah asked me 2 days ago when we were discussing with her establishing a proper Ghanaian embassy here in Jamaica. Does Jamaica need a visa to go to Ghana? She says, well, I don't need one to come here. What do you think? We do. Develop a Caribbean airline and that serves Africa. That's my 5th point. I'm getting through it quicker than I thought. Develop a global secure communication network for use by the African diaspora. Theo Chambers, webmaster and marketing expert, my partner and husband, founded Pan-African, Pan-Carib Business Solutions and offered the Pan-African Federalist movement of the Caribbean a vehicle to access secure communication, education, and global trade through accessafrica.com. That's accessafrika.com. We'd like for you to take a look, and we'd like some feedback from that. This is currently, he's building an infrastructure along with our partner Felipe Nugura, the regional coordinator for the Pan-African Federalists based in Trinidad. He's a veteran telecommunications consultant and coordinator. And they are most concerned with how we will continue to communicate, especially during the most advanced stages of our campaign, if we want to be successful. The goal, of course, is uniting African states within less than a generation, within 20 years or so, approximately. So this is essential. Travel exchange, number 7. It's a travel exchange Sankofa program that seeks to unite Africans who travel independently, ages 18 and older, from the Caribbean to United States, from the Caribbean or United States to Africans on the continent, beginning with West African countries that we are more closely related to, and then we'll expand outward. These would be cultural immersion programs of 1 to 3 months or longer, where visitors can stay in villages and learn the language, lifestyle, and just immerse themselves in Africa, the motherland. Upon completion, they would be required to present a journal and videos of their experiences for credit. Conversely, Africans seeking knowledge of our Pan-African heroes and heroines would come here to Jamaica and the Caribbean. They could choose to walk in the footsteps of Marcus Messiah Garvey, Bob Marley, Nanny of the Maroons, or any of our other heroes. We are seeking a linkage with interested institutions here, also at the university, who can partner with us to help develop this program for credit courses or degree credit courses for continuing education. And number 8, the spirit of Marcus Garvey lives forever and is manifested in reproduction of Pan-African literature. The printing presses of Miguel Lorne, who's back there, is one of our Pan-African lawyers, is very active downtown at 75 East Street. As a matter of fact, a box of Pan-African literature was placed in the hands of Samia Nkrumah, daughter of Kwame Nkrumah, just yesterday afternoon at the end of the launch a launch that was held in honor of the Reparations Research Center, which is newly launched on the 10th. Number 9, Philippe Nogora, whom I mentioned before, Pan-African Federalist, has proposed to plan the use of entertainment and Garvey lectures to empower the youth by disseminating live performances via social network media. In addition to this, Dr. Jumae Faye, Princeton University professor and Deputy International Initiating Provision Committee member of the PAFM, during his visit to Jamaica to speak on the ARIA-FM platform, the Marcus Garvey platform, he appointed Muta Baruka, Dub Point radio personality, Cultural Griot, as one of our champions. And of course, champion elder use their talent and experience to broaden our cause, open doors. Elaine Wint, as a female champion, veteran radio and TV journalist. Sizzla Kalanji, Queen Ifrika, whom you know well, cultural ambassadors for our movement, and they will speak to the youth wherever they go. So with this kind of assistance, we look forward to getting our message about this campaign that will take the message out of textbooks and put it into operation. Finally, number 10, Pan-Africanism. The Pan-African Federalist is a catalyst that can twin and connect academic institutions through the African diaspora. In terms of multidisciplinary sharing in science, math, and other areas, in developing think tanks, few research centers are owned by Africans. Have you thought why? Let's change that. The reason is that those who fund these centers of learning control the outcome of the research, and you know who they are. So there are several obstacles and solutions, and the old guards, one of them, refuse to relinquish their political, social, and economic power to a united African states where power is centralized. So the revolutionary push is getting stronger and stronger. What will you do, and what will your role be as students, as citizens, right? Where will you place your commitment? For united African sovereignty, or what? Will we continue to just eat from the crumbs of the table? So finally, my last 2 minutes, Africa is the terrestrial group that has given birth to humanity, and as such should be the center of world civilization, and has been. Africa at this time cannot design a way forward that isolates itself from a borderless world, so we must begin to design marketing, management systems that acknowledge the right of Western European and Asian brothers and sisters to coexist, but we could not trust them to manage our affairs without appointing one of our own to oversee activities. We have specific ideas on land, and land should be leased, not sold, when it comes to investors coming from outside into the continent. And as my time is up, you see the paper removed. We'd like to say United African Chambers of Commerce is something Theo Chambers is working on as well. Updates will be placed at accessafrica.com. In conclusion, without the ability to choose policies and implement them, yes, without economic emancipation, as a sovereign nation, Africa today will continue as it has been, disunified and underdeveloped. May the spirits of Walter, Rodney, and Marcus Messiah Garvey be our guiding lights. Onward, ever. Backward, never. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you.
Next speaker is Latoya Nugent. Latoya Nugent is already well known for her dedication to promoting inclusive development and the rights of women and important rights of women and girls. In November 2014, Latoya co-founded Women's Empowerment for Change, Lead Change, with 20 other lesbian and bisexual women. Lead Change is dedicated to increasing the participation of lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender women in advocacy for their economic, social, and political rights, and creating safe spaces for them to vocalize issues, socialize, and support one another. That's all. Please join.
Hi everyone. I'm not well. I can't speak very loudly, so please forgive me. I'm a little bit nervous about this presentation because everybody has been critiquing capitalism, and I think I'm a fan of capitalism, but I hope Ajam won't crucify me. Right. So what Ajam asked me to present on was looking at Marcus Garvey and the vision and practice of economic emancipation, specifically what he calls, what Ajam calls queering the African liberation agenda from a working class and gendered perspective. I must say congratulations to the Institute for keeping the name and legacy of Walter Rodney and Marcus Garvey alive. For the next 15 minutes, hopefully I'll be taking you on a journey with Marcus Garvey, Walter Rodney, African economic liberation, working class queer people, working class women, and the oxymoron of feminist capitalism. It's not a typical academic journey because I'm not an academic, but I'm hoping that the journey will be for the benefit of the working class women and queer people, which is where my heart is. It is for this reason, though, that I have much admiration for the work and ideology of Rodney, in whose honor this symposium is being held. Rodney has several accolades, and you can imagine that the most significant one for me would be his methodology, what everybody knows as his groundings, or what you could call his revolutionary talks, which were located in Black Power. I admire him too because he was a revolutionary, a rebel man, and those who know me may think that I'm a rebel woman. And he recognized what many co-opted activists and advocates have failed to recognize, that for the people at the margins to be heard, they cannot speak to the establishment in polite tones. And in so doing, as working class oppressed people, we have to create a new core at the periphery, using our own tools and knowledge and methodology if liberation grounded in justice is what we want. So for me, Rodney's groundings represent my ideal of transformative engagement. And in Rodney's own words, I have sat on a little oil drum, rusty and in the midst of garbage, and some black brothers and I grounded together. I was prepared to go anywhere, and any group of black people were prepared to sit down and talk and listen. Because that, he believes, is black power, and that is one of the elements. Sitting down together to reason and to ground, as the brothers would say. We have to ground together. I also admire the work of Marcus Garvey, who is the primary focus of this symposium, and my journey with you this evening. I like Garvey, but I have reservations about the application of his philosophy in promoting the interests of working class people, working class women, and working class queer people. What I am proposing, therefore, is that queering and gendering Garvey's African economic liberation must start with an adaptation and an upgrading of the Walter Rodney practice of revolutionary talk. An upgrade is needed because Rodney, like Garvey, forgot his queer lens and his gender lens. Perhaps in the same way revolutionaries of our time may forget or miss some lenses that future generations will. Garvey's African liberation and his ideas around the practice of economic emancipation is located in black or African capitalism, because he believed capitalism was the ground in which African liberation must be rooted. Capitalism was necessary for Garvey's African liberation. I agree with Garvey, though Rodney didn't, and I agree because capitalism offers two pillars that are central not only to African liberation in a nationalistic race-first ordering, but it is also necessary for the economic liberation of black working class women and queer people. And the two pillars to which I refer here are profit and frugality. Many of you, especially my anarchist comrades like Ajamu, may disown me by the end of the journey this evening. But I do hope there will be a willingness to explore, rather than overthrow, how capitalism can become a site of justice and liberation for black working class women and queer people. While Garvey and I agree with the centrality of capitalism to African liberation and the vision and practice of economic emancipation, I will explore some points of departure, chief among them being his nationalism and how it invisibilizes minority populations and working class experiences. Garvey's African liberation forgets almost every unit of analysis except race. And though Garvey was mildly progressive in respect of women's liberation, his views of women who were in the political movement was steeped in white patriarchy and a mirroring of the successful white woman of status. The final lap in this journey will talk you through my working ideology of a feminist capitalist ordering of society towards an idea of African economic liberation that is not limited to men and women of status, but which includes working class women and queer people through the mastery of financial literacy and management, the pursuit of profit, and the practice of frugality, all of which I believe must start with queered and gendered versions of Rodney's groundings. So welcome to the journey. And before I go any further, let me just say I'm experiencing a kind of what academics call cognitive dissonance with the term queer, because I do appreciate the ease with which it allows for conversations about people who do not fit dominant ideologies of sex, sexuality, and gender, but I hate the word. And I probably have the same struggle with the term working class, but what better way to describe a large category of people who have been robbed of our agency and denied access to wealth creation opportunities that enable us to live with dignity. Marcus Garvey's vision and practice of emancipation suited his time. Garvey's ideologies existed in a time in the US when people of his race were being murdered, marginalized, discriminated against, and generally regarded as less human because of their race and color. Garvey understood white power as located in economic liberation and independence, a liberation he believed needed to be capitalist in orientation. Garvey's politic for African economic liberation was informed by the lived experiences and realities of his black brothers and sisters. He believed that the absence of economic liberation and economic power resulted in the disempowerment of his race by the white race. It was the absence of this economic liberation that gave rise to imperialism and what Rodney calls the underdevelopment of Africa by Europe. History and present realities demonstrate that Europe is guilty of raping Africa of its humanity, wealth, and resources. In his race-first teachings, Garvey therefore encouraged the black race to adapt and mirror the capitalism that made whites rich, economically independent, and liberated. It gave them power and control. And Garvey wanted the African race to believe that we too had the capacity to amass wealth and power in the economic emancipation project, which he accepted was the source of economic liberation. But he perhaps didn't realize that the white model was inherently an exploitative model. In Garvey's African economic polity, commerce and industry were sites of liberation. They would form the core of the economic life of the state, as Africans would own and control the state through commerce and industry. In Garvey's opinion, quote, without commerce and industry, a people perish economically. The Negro was perishing because he had no economic system. African people would be protected, in Garvey's thought, from discrimination if we achieved financial independence and could sustain our economic needs and cooperative ownership of the means of production. Profit in Garvey's African capitalism would be used for the benefit of the African community and the protection of the race. Garvey understood the value of profit and frugality. It is my belief that the pursuit of profit and the practice of frugality can serve working class women and working class queer people. A gendered, queered African adaptation of capitalism can result in a just community for the African race, which I'll explore later. I believe that the distrust many social justice activist scholars may have for capitalism is rooted in the unethical or unjust practices of capitalists rather than capitalism itself. Patriarchal capitalism is problematic and should be overthrown. Racist capitalism is problematic and should be overthrown. Sexist capitalism is problematic and should be overthrown. And queerphobic capitalism is problematic and should be overthrown. Capitalism without injustice is where I believe profit for the working class is located. But Garvey missed it. He only saw race, Negro producers, Negro distributors, Negro consumers. And he saw one African nation, and we know that nationalism tends to dislocate and invisibilize the individual. In this case, the lived realities of the working class woman and the working class queer person. But profit in capitalism for Garvey was not an individual enterprise. This begs the question, I am sure my favorite anarchist, Ajamu, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you, would ask, can Garvey's ideology adequately respond to economic marginalization and poverty, or does it have the potential to cause massive economic, social, and political alienation for the working classes in the Caribbean, in the Caribbean, Africa, and elsewhere in the global African community? If I answered this question in the early 1900s, I would probably say it was an adequate response. But over a century later, I would have to say it would cause massive alienation of the African working class. African working class people were not only vulnerable to being exploited by white capitalists, they would also be exploited by the African capitalist class. This brings me to the value and importance of Rodney's groundings. If we were having revolutionary talks with our working class people using Rodney's methodology, we wouldn't, or Garvey wouldn't miss the distinct realities of his African people who were affected by layers of discrimination, not just race. I must hasten to point out, though, that while Rodney's approach could and should have uncovered intersectional forms of injustices that would serve as barriers to the economic liberation of all working class Africans, including women and queer people, it didn't, because those Rodney engaged in conversation were primarily his black brothers in the struggle. Understanding the alienation of the African working class man was not sufficient and did not offer solutions to the unique realities of the African working class woman or the African working class queer person. But if we explored the queering and gendering of Garvey's African economic liberation by starting with an adaptation and upgrading of the Walter Rodney practice of groundings, we would then begin to validate and make visible the experiences of the working class. We would create knowledge-sharing opportunities not just for, but within working class communities of women and queer people. Groundings can facilitate the economic emancipation and liberation of our vulnerabilized people and offer opportunities for what is described as the collective economic development project. Without a gendering and queering of Rodney's groundings, our conversations will miss the impact of patriarchy on the agency of working class women. We will miss the impact of African patriarchy on queer working class women. We will also miss the impact of African sexism on the economic liberation of working class women. And we will miss the impact of patriarchal, sexist, racist, and queerphobic capitalisms on the alienation of working class women and working class queer people from a clean environment, alienation from employment and good working conditions, from discriminatory free healthcare, from education and other social services, from wealth creation, from financial and economic empowerment, from financial literacy and money market education, from post-election political power, from investment and enterprise loans, from ownership of the means of production and innovation, and also alienation from justice. So while Rodney's groundings were revolutionary and effective, the agency and power of working class African women and queer people were not included in his groundings. They were also excluded from Garvey's economic emancipation project for the African nation. Garvey's economic emancipation project needed to do more work to be inclusive. I contend that Garvey did not sufficiently rethink white capitalism, which was and is both patriarchal and racist. To replicate capitalism in the way Garvey proposed would inadvertently result in the exploitation of women, the working class, and queer people within the African community. In this respect, I agree with Ajamu's criticism of Garvey's African capitalism. It demonstrates how Garvey ignored the working class to the peril of the race. Garvey needed to significantly rethink who was included and who would benefit from it. I would say his perspective would have created a new oppressive class within the African community, but I won't be unkind to a national hero. But Garvey and many Garveyites missed what feminists have long recognized, that the personal is political, therefore liberation of the individual self is as important as the liberation of the community. It is not one or the other. What I would therefore like to propose as I come to the end of this journey with you this evening is that in queering and gendering Garvey's ideology around capitalism, I'd like to propose that we reconceptualize profit in what would be my version of feminist capitalism, something that a lot of people don't think exists or can exist. In reconceptualizing profit, we wouldn't see profit only in terms of its monetary value, but in terms of justice. Justice for the environment, justice for women, justice for queer people, justice for children, profit as justice. In my feminist capitalist society, classist capitalism would not exist, and the working class probably would not exist if we're defining the working class as that category of people who have been robbed of agency and denied access to wealth creation opportunities that enable us to live with dignity. If profit is reconceptualized to include the cleanest possible environment, the best possible schools in communities, the best working conditions in all places of work, the best possible care at hospitals, if those become the indicators of profit, I think we can envision a feminist capitalist society that has profit and justice at the center. It may sound impossible or unlikely or utopic to many of you, but another pillar of capitalism that I appreciate can make this possible, and that other pillar is frugality. Frugality is about being thrifty and avoiding waste, delayed gratification, and a refusal to be slaves to consumerism. You may ask, how will this contribute to the economic liberation of African working class women and the queer people? And I will use the example of a program which I'm closely associated with. It's called Money Justice Live, which is an online series of conversation that is it's a We Change and Astral Lesbian Foundation Justice initiative. Money Justice Live is grounded in the idea of Rodney's groundings. It's a technological upgrade and an audience upgrade in terms of diversity. Money Justice Live is a 5-part series, a conversation series with a working class father of 3 daughters who grew up in a working class household, and he ensured that his parenting included the socialization of his daughters to value mastery of financial literacy and financial management as essential for financial independence. From as early as primary school, he taught them how to save and how to invest in the stock market. He taught them through his own informal education and groundings how to understand the money market and access it as working class women, and use that knowledge and access to improve their financial standing while investing in their education. Money Justice Live is conducted in the style of Rodney's groundings between, and the father is my father, it's between my father and I. And it's for young women and for queer people, giving them advice on how to get on that journey of financial independence. The conversation targets working class women and queer people with humble earnings, and it promotes frugality as a starting point for profit in the long term. Profit as providing for your children the best possible education. Profit as being able to save and invest for self and the future of the children. Profit as using resources carefully and protecting the environment in doing so. And the feminist capitalist spirit of the conversation series is evidenced by the continuous sharing of that financial education and financial management skills with the people who have been robbed of agency and wealth creation opportunities. The working class people, the working class woman, the working class queer person. And the series will wrap up next week, but we have already we are seeing evidence of how the series is changing people's lives, changing their relationship with money and changing their relationship with the market. If we are able to create the kind of revolution that Rodney created through his grounding, if with conversations like Money Justice Live and other interventions, we are able to create the kind of revolution that Garvey envisaged through capitalism, guided by both feminism and race, we can create a feminist capitalist society that offers wealth creation opportunities for all of us, that does not require or demand exploitation of any group or category of people and will eventually result in a profitable and just society for all people, even if some may end up having a little bit more than others. I believe upgrading Rodney's work and Garvey's ideology with feminist justice can change the circumstances for African working class women and queer people. It's feminist justice and feminist capitalism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nugent. I now invite Dr. Nye to join me on stage. Dr. Nye holds a Ph.D. in Sustainable Development and a Master's in Economics, and he creates when I give long introductions for him. So now,
First time I come to the organizers. So, vision and practice of economic emancipation today. Like I done the title inside of social and mind of Garvey and Walter Rodney. I just added that to the title just based on what a person is presenting. Walter Rodney, it was a Walter Rodney, a communist. You heard that in the presentation. Marcus Garvey is a capitalist. That is coming out in the presentation. And so while I was sitting there, I started to think, what is the definition of a capitalist and a communist? Remember my own bias as Rastafari, and we burn every ism. Socialism, capitalism, communism, all of the isms have been problems because they don't originate amongst the people. The context and space and place in which they origin determine how they are practiced. Nothing to do with our people as well. So I just said to myself, what things were done by those persons because they can define something based on the actions of the persons. I'm really don't ever really try to go deep into analyzing what those persons did and then say, okay, this is what they are. We cut and paste a label and put on those persons. For example, we started Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had an idea which says that we need to liberate a nation of people who are being oppressed in a particular space and place and time. And the liberation has to be holistic. You know, social, political, economic, cultural, all of those things Marcus Garvey did. That's why I have those programs, so you can do it from the programs. Marcus Garvey was doing this in a space and place where people think that he would have been taking risks. Of a persistent, of a innovative, of a creative, of all of these things. Now today, which word you would find somebody who is creative and innovative and take risks and is a disruptor of any processes? Is an entrepreneur, not no capitalist, not no communist, none of those things. But it's not just a regular entrepreneur. Because he was a mission-driven person who thought that they need to sustain the programs through an independent income stream. They can't be begging people to start out the program, especially those who are pressing you. Now the term we used to call that today is social entrepreneur. Mission-driven organizations that sustain their activity through an independent income stream. And when the profits are made, they don't go into the pockets of the business person, but they're reinvested to grow the business and to finance the programs that help you to fulfill that mission. So we're going to invite you to take a look at the model that Marcus Garvey had created. The UNI, it was an overarching organization. He established the African Communities League. And the African Communities League was the business arm. So on the African Communities League, you have the Black Star Line Shipping Company, which is a transnational trade organization, which made sense because around the time it was formed, World War II, World War I had ended. There were lots of ships there. Everybody was talking about Africa being the source of wealth. And there was no trade relation between African people and Caribbean people in a meaningful way. So as an opportunity emerged as an entrepreneur, he was seizing that opportunity. But he also recognized that they need to build, they need to endogenize growth, and therefore what they did was to establish what? The Negro Structure Corporation. Today we call the Negro Structure Corporation micro, small and medium enterprises. He also established other forms of business, what we call non-enterprises today. Note, remember that capitalism is based upon what? Selfish self-interest. If you read Rupert Lewis's work, he will tell you that none of the money that Marcus Garvey was trying to generate was for his own personal gain. It was always to reinvest, grow the business, fulfill the mission. But also, only can't talk about Marcus as no capitalist and no ism being attached to Marcus. It simply means I wouldn't really understand what Marcus was doing because sometimes we still focus on the peripheral and not going to the root. I'm saying unapologetically, you know. It's the problem with academic people, you know, like I said. For peace, I would be more peripheral. When you read things about these things and reinvestigate it. Walter. Tired of hear people talk about Walter and their communists. So I asked Prof. Lewis what we think is an author than these things at the last presentation. You know, because Lord Diana was there saying that the British are communists. Prof seemed that clearance are communists and the dependence of theorist person. But one thing was clear is that the Brethren was saying we need to look at what is happening in our society and rethink the approach towards development. I'm going to tell you people talk about Burnham. I said Burnham organized Walter Rodney, whatever, the killing of Walter Rodney.
Friday 13th.
Yeah, and nobody asked, so how comes Guyana, the only country in the world, just called the Corporate Republic of? Remember, there's the name of Guyana, it's not Guyana. There's the Corporate Republic of Guyana. And him argue that Guyanese people, both Indian and African, will work together to build Guyana for Guyanese. That's how it started with Burnham and Jagan. And then all of a sudden there's a division between Burnham and Jagan. And then Walter, who had the same idea of advancing his people, there's a division between Burnham and Walter. So the division come about. Who sowed the seed of the division? So we keep complaining about Burnham but not talking about who sowed the seed of the division. As they get distracted by Burnham while them still sow seeds of division. So much so that we are still ascribing the same people who sow the seed of division titles to the people who we are celebrating. So there's a problem, like a presentation. How do we know that we know? You know, and if we really liberating our mind, I know enslaved people cannot serve free people. If you have an enslaved mind, you cannot serve free people, and sometimes the things that were so free but were so enslaved in the shock. Because we still see the people through the lens of those who enslave you. But you know why you can't say communism, but they can do it half a year. And we learn about Marxist elements are racist as well. Still, there's no anything you can serve our people. None. So part of the struggle then is how do we come up with something, a term that really reflects who we are. So that's that you know called copy bugger. That we can create our own words, man-made words. We can create our own things that says, this is who we are. There are a couple of celebrated people in the discussion. You know, and I think we have to go, again, I'm going to set in the room. But speak of Marcus, where there's no doubt that Marcus is a professor emeritus in entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. You have to ask that, because it's a practice and how you work influence people that will make you become a professor. But also know the work of Walter and the crucials of the work that Walter did. But in between Marcus and Walter, there's a virgin named Arthur Lewis. Real capitalist. Him is the person who them use to promote this madness that we have as our development approach within the Caribbean. But in theories of unlimited supplies of labor. So when you talk about people being exploited as laborers, Arthur Lewis, who we celebrate more than Marcus Garvey and Walter Rodney, argued that the people value of their labor is so cheap that if you pay them anything above the average productive labor, which is equal to zero, you got unlimited supplies of laborers. I remember they argued that during the 1950s and 60s when Jamaica had the highest growth rates, and we were linked into the primary industrial sector, in particular agriculture as well. And this man who them give them give some Nobel Prize. Yeah, man. I know that, you know. When a guy in Rome give you a title, you think him acknowledging the work that you have done for him, you think the work that you have done for your people. Every day we celebrate industrialization by invitation. Today we call it foreign direct investment approaches. I will still believe that those guys who enslave and exploit are willing to come here to invest, to build you. It's always that, you know. As a going in the council room, see picture nice and big inside here. Anytime I go in there, my idiot becomes said, this is the guy who caused people to be constantly enslaved economically. Anyway, we'll check different, man. This even right about scholarship. So I'm inside here, a whiteboard. And we have a erasable marker. You used to have blackboards and chalk, so it's chalk and tar. I was, oh, Walter Rodney said, ground zone, my brother. How much persons inside the university use a grounding methodology in them teaching approach? Pedagogy we are talking. How much university lecturers use a grounding methodology in teaching approach? Them don't call it grounding, them call it experiential learning and reverse classroom. Learning by doing, where persons actually go into the field and do the work and assess them based on the work they do, and not based on memory. That's a computer with a large hard drive so you can store memories. Memory this one. Your brain is for thinking and doing and practice. We don't need no enslave of whatever these things because people who are lecturers determine the teaching method they use in their course. So I love to talk about people, I love good them there, we have a chance to practice, we're not practicing it. I will still expect the youths. And we don't even understand these youths now because we talk about Marcus 100 years ago, Walter Rodney 70 years ago. Who are these young people that we have today in front of us? What is their mindset? What are their characteristics? Do we know the characteristics of these people that we are speaking to today? Do we question whether our methodology suits their mindset? You know what I'm saying? The traits are these young persons very confident. Like to work in small teams. They have a global perspective and they have a very entrepreneurial mind. Which means that when you say to these people, think outside the box, they laugh off of you because they know that the box don't exist. While you who are trying to think outside of the box have your brain in a box. Now, how can you breathe inside a box? It's oxygen you need, you're suffocating, you're stifling. So all those who are stifling must tell people to breathe freely. You don't go up and plane and say the plane will crash. What do you think about your nose first before you attend anybody else? We need to clear our own heads. Remove that thought that a box exists. Because no box is just a damn thing there, and I can know what's in a box that exists. Yeah, no box that exists. And Burning Spear tell you. So when people talk about capitalism and communism and all those isms, Burning Spear says, don't you know that social living is the best? That no socialism, people working together to do what they need to do. Self-reliance, collective security. No word capitalism, you know. No, so why do I say inside the social entrepreneurial mind, who's an entrepreneur? They are that entrepreneurs in the process of creating value by bringing together a unique set of resources in order to seize an opportunity. No, we don't mention the word business, you know. It's a process of creating value by bringing together a unique set of resources in order to seize an opportunity. Now tell me, what is that Marcus Garvey was doing? And he was very successful at it. The business might not have worked, but he seized the opportunity to sow a seed in the minds of many persons. That what man has done, man can do. Whether it's white man, black man, child man, or any man, man can do. The way it is used is different. What does what are they doing as well? It's the same thing. It is the same thing. So we start with ourselves, man. I just know what we say. Guys, as researchers and lecturers, must first start with ourselves. You know, and question if we're really free in our minds. Are we free enough to guide these youths who are born free? We as well as the same culprit who socialize them to become both a slave. Because when enter in the university and we have that meeting by admin, we tell them that there is some privileged 2% or some elitist group. How do we allow them to think? We do not allow them to think. Because our process of teaching and examination is based on memory, not thinking. And those who choose to think, is a wrong back. Yeah, you fail the exam. We give people multiple choice questions in med school. That's when I got that after multiple choice question, they ask you. We don't realize these things. They do exactly what teachers do. And then we complain and say, you're not revolutionary. I mean, you're not revolutionary. Just trying to live with the idea of you be a revolutionary man. Look what the school fee we are charging. We're charging more money for live on the campus than to come to school for learning. Like the people say you come to school for live on campus. And we were talking about the university, you take honesty in terms of the discourse, man. See, and that's why I want to line about the university. You know, I tell that all the while. People don't read the document. When I want to come and listen to people and not read them. I'm telling you, man, the university is my biggest joke I've ever seen in life. When I read it, and I like, hearsay, that's the next problem. Read the virgin thing for yourself, I'm telling you, man. Be about them same one, tell him. Ask him, but let him write in papers, oh. Yeah, man, write it, man. More than one, tell them some really nice, colorful Jamaican words. I remember, you must check the English in Jamaica. You know, so it's only Jamaican words are bad words. So. All of the English words, them good. But every Jamaican word bad. So that if you're Jamaicanness, them wanted to express. You show me things at the time, I don't know. It's not show you, because we are talking, that them usually the water there. You just start talking, tell say time, but so fast 15 minutes done. But the reality is, if we really want to celebrate the work of Marcus Garvey and Walter Rodney and all those other persons who have done many things before us, it really means just embracing self for what self really is, you know? Embracing our own Caribbeanness and our Jamaicanness and recognizing the uniqueness within our own selves. And if you're able to recognize the uniqueness within oneself, through free mind, you also recognize the uniqueness with every other being around us as well. Because remember, you know, if you're in a space and place where everything is connected, even by the area you are connected, if you place limitation on any being within that space, it means that ultimately you place a limitation on yourself. But if that's what I mean by I say only yourself can free your mind, give thanks.
The hardest job in the world. Thank you very much. And you kind of back me up, you know, don't just back me up. That's alright. Our final presenter is Chanel Broden. She was ready to Jamaica in 2015 after completing her Bachelor of Arts as a Political Science and International Relations major at Wesleyan University. Ms. Broden founded Aluja Collection, a non-profit in Port Antonio that works to support projects that advance socio-economic and environmental transformation in Jamaica. Please help me welcome Ms. Lewis.
I am happy to be here with you. My task for today is to present my project as a case study. My project is Aluja Collective. We're located in Port Antonio, and I'll be looking at how it is that we develop and execute collectivist economic development that centers young people. So what to expect? So we'll go through the principles that really ground the work we do. Some of that comes up is consent, libertarian education, equity. We'll look at how the project takes shape, and then we'll respond to the question of how it is that Aluja marshals an alternative to economic development that centers young people. So firstly, what is Aluja? I must say this, if at any time you are lost, just make a note of it so we can come back to it through the Q&A section. This is an idea that we're trying to enact and develop, right? So what is illusion? So we're trying to create a community of thinkers and doers who use research, art, and ethical entrepreneurship to cultivate ways of life that dignify the individual, the community, and the earth. Simply put, we are a center for reflection and action. Now that's a lot of words, but what does that really look like? We want to create a space that is inclusive and accessible to everybody, but especially for people who are systematically marginalized. And for Colonial, I can say for Jamaica, that means focusing on young people, mostly between the ages of 0 to 24, and women. So that means providing them with these theories and ideas that they can understand the world as a social construct, so they want to act up on it and transform it. Another thing that we do or want to do is to provide those physical resources and tools so they can embark on projects, whether it's a business or something really community-based or a non-profit focus that will really center social and environmental transformation. So where did this all start? So I left Jamaica 6 years ago, and I was really interested in questions of development. Why does poverty exist? Why are there developing countries versus developed countries? Why is there the inner city? Why is there urban versus rural? And that led me to the field of critical development studies. And for me, I became enchanted with this idea of finding alternatives. The world is a shitty, messed up place. I am young, I need to believe in something better. So for me, it was very important to find, what are the solutions for the people who are actually working to tackle these issues. So that led me to La Universidad de la Tierra, which is located in Mexico. It is a center for learning that was built by anthropologist Gustavo Esteva. And it came about as a response, providing the local indigenous communities there in Mexico with the tools they needed to respond to processes of modernization, to NAFTA, those big international policies and big top-down developments. So I went to La Uni and actually saw that operation, which is what I'm trying to enact in Jamaica, but with a different shape. Because as a critical development practitioner, we realize it doesn't work to just replicate models. Mexico is different from Jamaica. Port Antonio is different from Kingston. Within Portland, Port Antonio is different from Buffalo. I am different from him, right? And so whatever structure we come up with, it has to really mirror that diversity, right? So, what are our principles and approaches? And I'll go through them. The first one is freedom. And basically, we believe in self-emancipation. But that doesn't mean that we're individualistic. It means that there has to be a balance between the self and the community, right? There has to be reciprocity. Another one of our principles is consent and consensus in decision making. And another fancy term for that is direct democracy. I do not want anybody representing me. I want to have a seat at the table. I want to talk. We all want to talk. I don't want to have to grow up in this world not knowing the laws that govern me. I have to be a lawyer to understand the legal system and go to court and deal with all of that. No. In my community, I want to say how it is that I want to live. I want to be a part of, creating how it is that we all live. So, exactly. And then the last principle is equity. And I think a lot of times we get this mixed up. We conflate equity with equality. And for us, what's more important is equity. Because of different historic processes, different people are positioned different in the world. For queer, people of color, women, people with disabilities, we have a lower standing on the hierarchy, right? And so we need a little more to be on that level playing field. So those are principles. Now I want to talk about our approaches. Now these are the big theoreticals over there where we're trying to get to. They speak to how we want to live. Now I want to talk about how it is that we do that, how it is that we enact that. And the first one for us is Libertarian Education. Fight the name, but you mean a shout out to Paulo Freire, which for me is, kind of God, and his work with the pedagogy of the oppressed. And for Freire, the point of education is to emancipate. If you are learning something and you're learning it to be a cog in the wheel, you're learning it to get a 9 to 5 and make some profits put in somebody else's pocket, I'm sorry. For us, that's not the true meaning of learning. Learning should be about understanding ourselves and our community and wanting to construct something different and something better, right? And so that's our approach to learning and education. We also believe in the power of art as a medium to connect people. You have the academics, you have people living their regular lives, you have doctors. I think everybody understands art. Art brings people together and we recognize that power. So that's something we use to build bridges and to draw people into what we're doing. Where is nice? Another one of our approaches is entrepreneurship. For us, it is not capitalist in any way. We go to the heart of that meaning, which is what you describe as being about looking in your surroundings and seeing what your resources are, realizing what your limitations are, and working to create value, working to solve a problem. And if it is that you're matching up entrepreneurship with art and libertarian education, that can only mean that you're carrying out social transformation. One thing I must say though, in response to what I've been hearing in the room as we talk about entrepreneurship, I think we need to consider the environment. Because sometimes I think as humans, we think way too highly of ourselves. There's a universe, there's a planet, I'm atheist, so I'm not even talking about the whole God dimension. We live in community on this earth, and I think in thinking about these solutions and problems and all of this, we also need to acknowledge that, hey, there, is another environment. And so if it is that we're going to create an economic system, it has to respect the environment. And so our entrepreneurship cannot be exploitative of our resources. So we have to do that. And then the last one of our approach is building bridges. That's all I have. I think this is really pertinent to what you were talking about, and also nice. Something that we embark on is broadening the idea of who is Jamaican and the Jamaican community. I feel like a lot of times we're here in Jamaica, and because we're in it, we think, okay, we only have what is in that box. No. As Jamaicans, there is the diaspora, whether it's the Jamaican diaspora, the Caribbean, Pan-Africanism, or just being a part of the world. And it doesn't just mean looking to, Garvey or Rodney, or the people who've been looking to go forward. It means branching out. It means co-opting labels. They like to put us in this Latin American, Caribbean box for the sake of their own economic development. Well, what is happening in Latin America as it pertains to alternatives to development? Are we looking to those places? Are we, trying to find out what they're doing?
I don't. I wasn't going to.
Okay. So that's the idea of illusion. I must say it is very broad. Those are tenets, and if it is that it's something we're going to implement, it is going to look very differently in each community. So I'm going to talk about what it looks like for us in Puerto Rico. So at this point, we do not know what Aluja Collective will really look like in Puerto Antonio, but we have ideas. I'm from Puerto Antonio, just so you know. So we believe that, oh, sorry, missed something. Let me talk a little bit about Puerto Antonio and the social problems there. We're rural. The population of the town is 15,000. There's a lot of joblessness. The primary industries that they kind of say, oh yeah, we need to focus on our agriculture and tourism. The buzzword nowadays, by the way, is ecotourism. But at the end of the day, tourism is, you know, it finds its place within dependency theory. It's still a very gendered concept. It's still a very exploitative concept. The agriculture they talk about, trust, it's not organic farming or, you know, having good food, healthy food available for everybody in Puerto Rico. It's just like, oh, we want investors to come in, work you hard, work on your soil, and we make money off you. To put it simplistically. So that's Puerto Rico in a nutshell. So, based on what I just told you about what we're trying to accomplish and what's being prescribed for Puerto Antonio, this is our alternative, all right? We believe that we have to educate our community, but it can't be that I walk up to somebody on the corner like, hey, Mark or Fury or Garvey or Rodney. I'm sorry, that does not work. It means creating points of encounter through art, through social media, having events like film screenings, running a campaign through social media, having workshops like t-shirt printing or something. You know, people don't get a free t-shirt and they'll come, and while making t-shirt, we can talk and we can research. At the same time, we have to recognize the type of language we're using. Intersectionality is not going to work. You know, we have to start by focusing on, you know, simple things like respect and love and what it means to be in community. Because those are basic things that as humans, we all understand. And I'm not saying this to be like paternalistic or anything. It's just that we have to recognize that we're at different places and we have to meet people where they're at. Another thing we want to do is to have teachings where people who, whether you're in academia or just from your experience, are willing to come and share. Right? So far, we have a database of people from Puerto Antonio, from Jamaica, and other places who are willing to come in and talk about issues that are affecting Jamaica and issues that are affecting other places. We want to have a library, but not the kind of like, you know, the parish libraries or the national libraries that are, for me, just a big joke. We want a space where there is material, not just books, because books alone don't make a library, where people can come and actually have tangible material and they can read things and see themselves in the material that they're reading. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Does it?
Perfect.
And then we want to also have immersion programs, something a bit more organized where, you know, when people become much more interested in this, they can do like a 6 weeks program and get, you know, taught in, you know, the whole jargon and all those fancy stuff. And then the last thing, which is where a job wants me to spend my time, is to talk about how it is that we want to incubate co-op businesses and provide skills training. I have done also social justice work, and you know, within social justice we usually focus on, you know, the social part of life, gender, race, ableism, all of that. But at the end of the day, if there's no And I get what you were saying about, to be a full human being. I'm there with you. You have to work on that spiritual, emotional, intellectual stuff. I get that. But at the end of the day, as a working class person, if I cannot find food to eat, if I can't find food for my children to eat, if it is that I need to make it so I can take care of my mother and everybody else in my family, it's very hard for me to also think about social justice. And that's the reality of it. If you're not meeting people's material needs, it's going to be very hard for them to listen to you. And our way of tackling that is to address people's material needs. And so we want to incubate co-op businesses in Port Antonio. That means providing people with the support, the network, the knowledge of how and why co-ops are important and how and why co-ops matter. Do we all know what co-ops are? Okay, good. And we think co-ops really represent ethical entrepreneurship because it's the workers own the business. The workers make the decisions about what happened. And if it is that I'm from Port Antonio, I love my community, and I'm going to work with my team members to make profits, there's no way I am going to damage the place I live, right? So on more of our incubating co-op businesses. So we believe that reflection and action actually drives critical thinking about business structure and function. So it's not that people just come in and it's all create a business, create a business, create a business, create a co-op. No. While they're focusing on their business or their project, they're also taking part in the theory, right? And so it's all about the practice, the practical, and the theory, right? A difference between our idea of entrepreneurship and the status quo is, for entrepreneurship, they talk about competitive advantage and a whole bunch of stuff. For us, it's about turning people's passions and ideas into livelihoods. And then lastly, I think I said this before, the center wants to create a network of support, providing mentorship, tools, and know-how as to how to fundraise and build capacity so that people can create these alternative livelihoods. And that's it.
Thank you also for all our presenters for this spirited, energetic, and perfectly timed presentation. I learned. Because these things have the time limit, that's true. Sure. Yes.
Especially when you are
Yes, very, very good. I'd like to invite my friend to now conduct the question and answer section, please. And we have our hand up already.
I have a friend. Hi again. I agree with Shelley and Dr. Morgan. A very rich engagement this evening. We started off by hearing from one of our youth, a student here at the university, in her presentation of the on the issue of the relevance of Walter Rodney to students, academic workers, and the working class. And then we heard a range of issues being dealt with, from the way in which the academia and the humanities in particular is engaging the work of Rodney, right through to the issue of social entrepreneurship. We heard issues of the different polarizations of ideology. And one of the very big things that came out is how we think that the binary opposite of capitalism is communism, and that's how we sometimes throw Walter Rodney into that sea of prejudgment and all the confusion that causes. But while acknowledging all the powerful presentations, I must also highlight how we ended the symposium section a while ago with Chazelle's presentation, which kind of gives me life. It's kind of how I see that we are kind of now updating in a lot of what we think and how we have engaged things. But the good thing is that somehow, while we hold on to Rodney and his ideology and hold on to the idea for making money, that there is a way forward that we need to continue to chart. So our questions and answers will help to refine that moment. My dear friend Jerry Small is first.
This is a fact. This is a fact that most people in the world don't know, especially for the last 500 years. Every human being has the right to land. Most people in the world don't know that. That was deliberately left out of the Human Rights Charter in 1945. It was deliberately left out, and the system not meant to put that right in here. The right to land. Every human being has the right to land. And all over my virgin political have been talking for years. Not if the white people in the white country them know that. It's only the people that drop the land and police the land know, the landlord know it. If the rich, if the middle class white people in America and England and Europe and the don't know it, they must not know that. Much less our people. Every human being has the right. And them defend all of our rights now. But they not defend the human being right to land. And I heard the virgin that touch upon it. And it's a key to the understanding, especially of African people who have a family the way of free back themselves. And that is one of the first thing. And I heard my lady there, you touch upon land and knife. And by the way, I want to say, I like how knife put it in the same knife will stick to wood in terms of the capitalism of the Garvey and the communism of Rodney. But I like even treat people quickly to refer to the fact that every human being has the right to land, and you're not really give the little people them land for themselves, but at least their parents and adults. But just like when they reach the age of 18 or whatever age of 16 or 18, you have the right to vote. The same way, you have the right to land. And that's one of the worst thing them do, the reparation movement must take this in consideration. When them say them emancipate the so-called slave, in order to make them come back and work for wages. You're not fair on the land, because if you have a house spot, right living space means both a house spot and enough place to find. If you have a house spot and enough place to feed your family, you will not go work for no minimum wage of $7,000 a week. You might not go work 2 days out of the week. And the only way to secure the capitalist system is to deprive land, and they deprive them one people. They deprive them one white people, middle class people, working class people from land. So if I don't chat too long, I could get a response from the 3 hours when they touch upon land. That's beautiful.
Thank you, Bongo Jerry. Dr. John.
Or what we would do is probably take 3 questions and then respond to them so that we get more questions also. Maybe take 2 more.
Okay, all right.
And also,
and I want to highlight the fact that we are live streaming. We want to acknowledge our audience who are watching online, and to let you know that you can pick up a recording of this by putting in your devices live.mona.uwi.edu. That's live.mona.uwi.edu. My firebrand from the Eastern area, from Trinidad, and our friend right here. And then we'll take yours at the same time and then enjoy it.
Thanks very much. I just have 3 concerns I'd like to submit about the presentations, and I invite the panelists to make contributions in relation to them. The first would be gross generalizations about working class contributions to urban development, such as libraries, which have been part of literacy campaigns, often led by civil society and women in particular. Second would be, I think, a critique of Arthur Lewis economics. Louisian economics would suffice compared to Arthur Lewis, who as a young man in St. Lucia attended UNIA meetings himself. And Norman Govan goes at length to discuss the extent to which Arthur Lewis was engaged in a kind of decolonization politics, but much limited to the radical counterparts who would come afterwards. So the second things I would like to speak to is an assumption about the coherence of Walter Rodney's ideology. I think Walter Rodney lived 3 lives. One in Africa, another in 1960 in Jamaica with groundings. But I think his most unique contribution is Marxist thought in the Caribbean and Guyana, where he had to make considerations for the Indo-Caribbean experience to conceptualize the way you think about socialism. in a country where two parties claim socialist politics. And I was shocked that no one spoke to that as Caribbean people. And the last concern is that Marcus Garvey himself is an interesting character. He's married in 1919 to Amy Ashford Garvey, her former roommate and maid of honors, Amy Jack Garvey, who will marry him after the divorce in 1922. He's a wicked man. And Marcus Garvey, therefore, Amy Jack Garvey is going to write an essay called Women as Leaders. Amy Ashford Garvey said that we shouldn't have generic children in the UNI Charter, we should put boys and girls. So this idea that women weren't thinking at the same time while Marcus Garvey is doing his politics, even the women at his side were highlighting the limitations of his Pan-Africanist ideology. Likewise for Rodney. From the WPA, Red Thread came along, took up LGBTQ women in Guyana, took on the issue of indigenous women, and Red Thread sustained much more successfully than the political power that was never had by the WPA. So I'm very concerned about the saint worship of these figures and not putting them into the context of their time when they were actors, especially women, who do not complicate their narrative.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't think we can take any other question yet. I think we're okay this school, then we just deal with some of those questions. And then we go to your, and then we go to the two questions here. Anyone want to take on first? So let's address what was it?
No, the question of land is a fundamental thing, and when we're talking about collectivistic economic development and the movement away from capitalism, we have tools available to collectivize land. The community land trust, largely used in North America, is something that we can promote here. And what the community land trust does is that it takes land out of the capitalist buying and selling. It takes it out of the market mechanism of demand and supply, where the land is now owned collectively by the community for its use. It's not used for profit. Therefore, when we build homes or businesses on it, the property doesn't appreciate in a way that property outside of that is appreciated. And it deals with a fundamental African approach to land, is that land is based on use, not based on your access to money. And that's something that Rastafari has brought into the discourse. And when we talk about ITAL liberty, we ignore how Rastafari sees land as something that should be based on use. Your access to it is based on use and not based on your ability to rent it or buy it outright. So we have a tool that we can start to purchase land and vest it in the community and shift it out to the capitalist economic framework. But right now, that in terms of my teachers of in agriculture, there were Rastas in Spanish Town. But today you have Rasta in Kingston down no grow colour, Scotch bonnet pepper. They were growing on a bed, and I'm saying, but you have access to land in the country where you have a ton of bed. You know? Well, himself identified Rasta, but what I'm saying is that right here in Kingston, we have enough land in Trench Town that we can engage in agricultural production to feed a large percentage of Kingston's population. Why aren't we using cooperative entrepreneurship, create worker-owned businesses, and green this place? We have land all over the place. You go country and young youth now grow when they do a teach the older people them agricultural products. So when we put cooperative entrepreneurship on the agenda, we have a practical approach, we have a practical method to deal with wealth creation without embracing capitalist economic relations. Capitalism is what brought us into slavery, not white supremacy. White supremacy was created after as an ideological justification of the economic exploitation of Africans. If we only read Rodney's groundings, we may end up with this notion that Rodney wasn't a communist. And that I know. That I want to just read the groundings with my brother, which was a specific set of lectures given, advancing Black Power. But read how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Read other works, essays that he wrote. Our Garvey, We can't engage in some verbal, like verbal gymnastics to say Garvey wasn't a capitalist. Garvey said me a capitalist, me big up capitalism. So how today we ever come with a different version of the truth? So, you know, we have the tools to promote cooperative economic development, and we should pursue it. Here in Jamaica, an approach to economic development that we're not studying and using and drawing lessons from are the sugar worker cooperatives. The sugar worker cooperatives came under the Mandela government in 1974, where they vested ownership into 22 worker cooperatives where the worker owned, control and manage. There were problems with it because even within the Mandela government, there were forces who didn't want to see working class people controlling such a major sector of the economy. You had external capitalists, the IMF, the World Bank, who didn't want to see that. You had people in the Ministry of Agriculture, and it's for that reason that our economic development approach cannot be driven by this initiative of the state. It must come out of the people, as Rodney talked about, the self-emancipation of the people. So, but what we hope will happen is that, is that those of you who are interested in a different economic development path can get together so we can reason next time and start to develop practical ways of liberation. And that's what Garvey can offer us, is that it's not enough to talk, as our comrade Dean Waterboka said, that Marx made a claim that philosophers of the past just philosophize about society. The duty of revolutionaries today, whether you're a revolutionary intellectual or other types of revolutionary, is to change the society, to transform it, and to overthrow the oppressive structures that are here. We must not be afraid to say what our goals are. It's the destruction of capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia. That's our goal. So nobody can say we have an hidden agenda because we put it in writing and say, this is my agenda, and them still can't stop it. They didn't stop us during the time of enslavement. So let's do something different. Let's start to organize among the people and challenge Babylon here, because we're not putting pressure on them in Jamaica and other parts of the world.
Chairman, I directed this question to yourself and to Dr. Let me just hear from Chairman.
Yes, with respect to respecting what was just said, I approve and agree with everything you said there. But my specific example with my experience in Gambia, they have co-opted a similar program, eat what you grow and grow what you eat. They're doing that to survive, and their population is about the same as Jamaica. But what we'd like to see Africa is feed itself, use lands that are not being cultivated to grow more moringa trees, trees and food that can cultivate and feed and be nutritious to their population. So we'd like to see Africa feed itself as a continent and feed the world if it wants to, and also use land in productive ways, leasing lands and selling land to foreign investors who come in to raid the country. Also, the new land grab that we have going on now, we don't know how long it will take us to unify African states, become sovereign, to control what is going on through centralized government, but we know that that has to come to an end. The land grab is intense, and it is, breaking our people.
Thank you.
Just quickly, in land, I argue, all when a country has established a solid original base heading towards the future confidence. All when a country has established a solid agriculture base can look towards the future with confidence. They can't work with the road now. Know that in Jamaica, imported bad food kill more people than gunshot every year. 12,000 people then last year from diabetes, less than 3,000 people from gunshot. Secondly, the whole African nation that control all them land is which country? Zimbabwe. Everybody trying to make it like a criminal. You know what I say? So the land is actually more serious than we think. So what is the approach I'm going to take in Jamaica? Because I can't talk to them and I talk to myself. When I buy no land, I take land, I can't call me squatters. Asking that, is doing it. So when I tell you what to do. But my approach is that squatters, buying no land, taking the land, because I support the development. What is the evidence that I can do it? Because the government gives China people 2,000 acre land and say them supporting development. I do the same thing.
I want to push the discussion ahead though, because we still have some questions to answer there now from Amilcar Santana, who is from the St. Augustine campus, our university, and we want to welcome all the university family to this symposium. And he raised 3 issues. He raised the 3 iterations of Walter Rodney's life and work.
Yes.
He spoke about the work of Arthur Lewis and the theories of Arthur Lewis, and he positions that in the perspective that Arthur Lewis himself was a follower of the ideologies of Marcus Garvey as a member of the UNIA. And he spoke about the way in which Garvey himself, though being quite dubious and being very euphemistic here, in his relations with women in terms of how he negotiated his marriages, seems to have muted the voices of women while these very women were writing and presenting on their issues. Who would like to take on any of these?
So I'm talking about the Artemis thing.
Yes.
And the whole thing of Artemis being Garvey. And I talk about what the reality is. From that time to this time, the global agenda has been industrialization by invitation. That's a platform. We in the Caribbean have embraced, Jamaica in particular, has embraced that ideology more than anybody else. We have tried every economic model that relates to those things as well. It does not work. When Arthur Lewis, the fatal flaw in his assumption in the model was that he was saying that we need to ensure that when we make money from business, where do we get that money? Where do we put that money? Back in the hand of the one or the capitalists, because they alone have what? The incentive to reinvest. And so all of those investors have been non-Jamaican, non-Caribbean persons. Now today, 50 odd years after, how can we still be using that model? Does that mean that that assumption still holds? Because 50 years ago, probably not valid. Now the reality of Jamaica and Caribbean is what? We have a large diaspora, with a large capital base, and what we do in the Caribbean is offer a huge amount of incentive for non-Caribbean people, but we don't offer any special incentives for Caribbean people. And that is where the problem is. And as long as we continue to celebrate that industrialization by invitation, foreign direct investment policy, we will get no growth. Because no man who leaves this country to come and put money in your country is putting money there to grow your country. They're putting money there to make money, to send back to his country, which you should do. They can't live your country when they're in country. Now we are foolish to think that that man must love this country and love our country just how we love this country. There's an illusion, Virgin. You know, there's an illusion. And all men can even if you do that, get out of the illusion. But then when we follow Marcus Garvey or not, you don't realize, like in a Rasta, some people don't live like Rasta but don't live Rastafari. Like some people talk about them and live Marcus but don't live Marcus philosophy. That's why we have put up a bus on the side of our sport. You know why? Because I always say Marcus, who's a self-reliant, never make no bus.
So the question of Garvey's work in Guyana, the third phase, Rodney's work in Guyana as the third phase, I think you made some reference to that in terms of ideology, Marxist ideology, in reference to what Amilcar was saying. You want to weigh in on that any at all, Dr. Barnett?
Well, what I would say is what Rodney contributed, I don't know, I don't know talk about, was his definition of blackness. And what he did was he had an inclusive perspective. In other words, he said Indians, East Indians, and African people are one, come together as one, as black people. So he widened the definition of blackness to include. No, the reality is many East Indians do not actually see themselves as one with African people. And I want to say for the record that generally speaking, we as African people are very open and very embracing, but other groups tend to be more insular. So I put it to you, if everybody is being insular, the Chinese are insular, East Indians are insular, let's talk it for what it is. What is wrong with we as Africans being insular and practicing race first and looking after our own self-interest? The problem is we're looking after everybody else's interests except our own and ignoring that we live in a racialized world. Let's wake up and drink the coffee and look on the reality. Everybody's getting, the Chinese are getting ahead right now. Why do you think they have become a superpower in and of themselves? Who was Garvey's dream? He said, black man, you know, look to Africa, Africa for the Africans and abroad, and he said, make Africa a superpower, so that we will gain respect in the world today and equal. So we have to uplift ourselves. We still haven't reached there yet. We're talking about, you know, socialism, communism, and all of this stuff. What Garvey embraced was Africanity, African fundamentalism, African humanism. We have to look to our own culture for our own ideologies. And my thing is people get caught up in the Leninist Marxism and anarchism and all that. I don't see that as African. To be honest with you, let's start embracing our Africanity and look for the solutions within our African traditions. And let us, on top of that, realize that the notion of identity politics of being proud of your thick nose, your thick lips, of our hair texture. Garvey gave us the tools to do that. No other racial group can do that. Marx is not going to do that for us. It's Marcus Garvey. So before we denigrate Garvey on many levels, I hear a term about cooperative entrepreneurship. That is Garveyism. We realize it now. You may disagree. No, that is what Garvey was advocating with the Black Star Line Steamship Company. Everybody can buy shares in the company. You become an owner. You have ownership in that company. You know what I mean? So if the company, the more resources it generates, the more resources it spread out. Somebody mentioned Garvey never make a dime from the Black Star Line. He wasn't about greed and selfishness. He was promoting communalism. We have to generate wealth one way or the other to uplift ourselves as a people, but he was talking collectivism, not individualism. So the capitalism as practiced by Europeans is different than the capitalism, if you want to call it capitalism practiced by Garvey. Let's not muddy the water. Let us be clear about this.
Let's in relation to what he said.
Quickly, because we want to take more.
Yeah, you see a gap in the scholarship out of the university as relates to Marcus was that we spend a lot of time looking at the social ideas and the political ideas, but not much on the economic principles. As a matter of fact, it was written that these people around here in the university think that Marcus Garvey idea didn't fit any economic model because they were trying to cut and paste and put it. It was a different kind of idea. Marcus Garvey came up with the first crowdfunding platform over 100 years ago. And I sent our prison and say it's been fraud.
Yes, exactly.
It's crowdfunding, you know. So there's a Marcus is a social entrepreneur. It's how we look at what the social entrepreneur really is. In mission driven, when the mission is UNIA, how do we sustain it? By enterprise development owned by the people engaged in the enterprise.
Yes, yes.
Our econ people, you know, our econ department turned the back on Marcus Garvey and slung and look and say, okay, this is the model that is being developed. We were researching and said it fit into the Western economic model, or the closed economic model. Some model that have nothing to do with us at all. No, look at what the sister is saying. Everything that she has said is what Marcus Garvey was doing. Every single day, if you don't read Marcus Garvey, things like that, say, please go and that doesn't be a good reminder of who we really are. We're the same people. It took 100 years for our people recognize what the Virgin is saying. And look who's saying it. Is she saying it? We still try to put that Virgin in that little model that they have created. And that's why it hasn't worked. And today, we still haven't embraced that. So you know how now people call Marcus Garvey thief and play Iron because we see him as Marcus Garvey. That's that today, we're going on the same Marcus Garvey business model to build social enterprises across 200 communities, and I tell them, You have to pay $700 a day because they call Marcus Garvey a thief.
Thank you for that. There have two persons who have been waiting, and I want to remind us that time is going, so we're going to just take those two questions. I see some other hands. I think I'll be guilty of some of what we were saying earlier, that include a lady in the question. So I'm going to go with those two questions, the lady, and then I'll try and take very quick comments if there, please, from the other three. But let's go quickly. Yes.
Blessings, greetings one and all. What I'm about to say, it relates to earlier on in the discourse. Gentleman up there, I don't remember your name, forgive me for that. And madam over there. The race issue came up during your presentations a couple times. Now, I will say this explicitly. I am not in a box, and I am not in a class. If I'm in a class, is you put me there in your mind. And if I'm in a box, is you put me there in your mind. One of the worst things, ideas mankind has ever come up with is this classification, this division of people into classes. And I hear it continuously during our discourse. First class, second, it no work. We have to get you from that. And I want to challenge you as some of the most brilliant minds in Jamaica, in this room, to start rewrite history. And start to highlight that and say to people that, look, them thing here is foolishness. And it carry down, it carry backwards from then, and it still carry backwards now. You know, so we have to get rid of them things. Even how we speak and how we communicate, we have to just knock away all of them things then. That we have to say.
Thank you very much.
Makes sense. All right, my comment is that, first of all, let me pay respects to Marcus Garvey. As a 17-year-old, I was inspired by him when I was elected president of the Normal College Union. I was there doing pre-medicine. And we had people, right. Well, I'm a native of Jamaica, partly Taino by descent. Partly Taino by descent and other mixtures, as you can see. But really, I'm committed to this country because Jamaica is really the land we love. But growing up in England, Marcus Garvey was an inspiration to me. So I was saddened when I heard a gentleman comment, you know, that he was a terrible man. Because one thing, I saw Garvey as, because I was brought up in Indian philosophy, or Indian religion, Hindu-Christian religion, and Garvey to us is like a sannyasi, that is, he's a renunciant. So he used capitalistic methods to earn money, to generate income, but essentially he divorced himself from it, and he shared it with his community. So that makes him a true sannyasi, and the remarkable thing is that many white people truly embrace Garveyism, although they call it something else. And one of the things they embrace there is Garvey's idea about self-reliance. Because when I came out to Jamaica for the first time, I left here as an infant, I associated with a white, what you call a white, I don't normally call them white, but since you use the term, a white Englishman, Dennis Adams, who ruled the floor of Jamaica. And the first thing Dennis said to me is, your line of research in Paris, it's very, very high flow, and it will not help Jamaicans to put food on the table. But if you get into some ecology, plant ecology, and study the local plants, the endemic plants, that is plants that grow nowhere else on this earth but in Jamaica, that would be a better idea. Now, this is a white man who said this to me. And he pointed out to me that this is really true self-reliance. And Dennis's words are true. Fast forwarding to these times, I was recently at a meeting, a cannabis conference, when Henry Lowe, who I've known for years, said that he has spent a lot of money coming onto this campus. He set up the RDI Institute, but he's sad because he's losing money because he went into nutraceuticals, developing cannabis products. So Henry says he's going to abandon nutraceuticals and go into pharmaceuticals. And here we are discussing the fact that one reason why black people are held in their place is because of capitalism, and the pharmaceutical companies are the worst capitalists. Because they literally are vampires. They abstract money from the sick, and sometimes they make people sick with the pharmaceuticals. So Henry had the right idea, but you see, Henry is changing up. And this brings us into this whole thing about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is really a rebellious notion. It's a way of getting out of a problem. I've met entrepreneurs who have kissed cockroaches down there because a long time they had to lay down in the dust. And then they rose up like phoenix from the ashes to become very wealthy. So entrepreneurship is not an easy road. And you can't really teach it. It's something that people create. Why? Because they're getting away from something. So if they follow some other road, it's not the right path. So I just wanted to comment on that, and I think we need to change our ideas about entrepreneurship and what we embrace. And if we go into relating very specifically to Jamaica or any of the small island developments, and they focus on their own endemic material, like the endemic plants which grow nowhere else, they might actually get ahead and get out of, you know, the alien trap. The other thing is the use of the word. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a Guyanese, and I thank you guys for.
Actually, listen, one touch, please. Remember, we also speak streams so people need to hear where they are.
Yes, I thank you for the interest that you have shown and are showing concerning my countryman, Walter Rodney. Well, my question, or more like a comment or suggestion, I'm doing theology, and as a part of my studies, we have a course by the name of Peruvian Theology. And one of the things that I noted this evening is that theology was not a part of the presentation. And I think that to divorce a man from his God is really detrimental. We need to understand the part that theology played in our being slave for 400 odd years, right? So I think more research should be done on theology and slavery, and we'll understand why we face what we are facing now. But my actual question or comment is, as people who are still reeling from the ills of colonization and a new form of imperialism in the form of globalization, and as Caribbean people, we seek success at all costs for ourselves and families based on the presentation we heard it. Thus, any collective form of resistance to pull down the walls of oppression, that is the capitalism, it is no longer sought after because we rather conform and wait on betterment than fight and resist. I think that is a part that we should really look at. Right? Because everybody wants to survive, everybody wants to get rich at all costs. And we need a re-examination and self-examination. Go back to Garveyism and Walter Rodney, and we will understand. Thank you.
Really want